When did the Second World War really begin? If you ask an American, they might say the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. A proud Russian might say the war started when Germany invaded the USSR on June 22nd, 1941. A Pole, upset at being forgotten again, would then declare that the war really began on September 1st, 1939. But who's right? We reckon none of them, because by the time the Germans marched into Poland, a war in Asia had already been raging for 2 years, claiming millions of lives. In this video, we tell the story of World War II's bloody prelude and the 2 years of fighting that set the tone for the entire Pacific theater. On July the 7th, 1937, Japanese private Shimura Kikujuru wandered away from his post in search of a place to drop the kids off at the pool. He was one of the 15,000 Japanese soldiers stationed in northern China preparing for a grand invasion of the Soviet Union. But across the Yongding River in Wanping Fortress, all the Chinese soldiers could see was a load of well-armed Japanese troops doing maneuvers. When Private Kikujuru's commander noticed he was missing, he demanded the Japanese army be allowed over the river into the Chinese fortress to search for him. The Chinese garrison flatly denied the demand. Infuriated, the Japanese commander decided to force his way in with a company of infantry. By the time Private Kikujuru returned from his ill-timed break, Japanese and Chinese troops were shooting at each other. This engagement became known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. But these were also the first shots fired in the Battle of Beiping-Tianjin in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and, by extension, World War II. Between 1937 and 1939, China suffered 1.03 million military casualties, amounting to half of its 1937 strength. Civilian losses were inordinately higher, with some estimates reaching 6.25 million deaths. The invading Japanese also suffered 220,000 military casualties during the first 2 years of the war. To put that in context, the most costly campaign in Europe before Barbarossa was the Battle of France. 135,000 French and German soldiers were killed in total. Battles raging across China killed 10 times as many soldiers, not to mention the appalling numbers of civilian deaths. Many of these unfortunate casualties came from a battle known as Stalingrad on the Yangtze, or more conventionally, the Battle of Shanghai. A little over a month after Private Kikujuru's dump started a war, the Japanese army attacked Shanghai. Their propagandists claimed that the ancient port city could be captured by the racially superior Japanese in 3 days, and the rest of China in 3 months. In reality, the tenacious Chinese defended the city tooth and nail for 3 months and 13 days. The battle was fought in the most brutal way possible: urban, close quarters, and house to house. China's Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, knew he couldn't hope to win against the Japanese without international support, so he decided to turn the city's defense into a statement. He wanted the world to see that the Japanese advance could be stopped, and that even a small number of defenders could inflict devastating casualties. Battered Chinese units held out in pockets throughout besieged Shanghai. Their orders from high command were simple, yet suicidal: defend to the death. The Sihang warehouse was one position Chinese forces holed up in to make their last stand. The defense of the warehouse only lasted a week, but in that time, 452 Chinese defenders held off 20,000 soldiers of the Japanese 3rd Division. The Japanese threw wave after wave of infantrymen and tankettes at the Chinese, but they were rebuffed each time. During the height of the battle, the Japanese brought a siege ladder to scale the warehouse's walls. Unfortunately for the attackers, they scaled the ladder and ran right into Colonel Shi Tsinyuan, the Chinese commander. Not one to stand back and let his men do the dirty work, Tsinyuan promptly struck a Japanese soldier with one hand, grabbed the man's rifle with the other, and shot a second soldier off the siege ladder with it. This guy was not messing around, and neither were his men. By the end of the battle, the Chinese soldiers had killed over 200 Japanese and lost only 10 of their own. The defense of Sihang Warehouse was immortalized as the last stand of the 800 heroes by Chinese propagandists. But last-ditch defenses like this one were happening right across besieged Shanghai. Endless pummeling from the air and sea eventually forced the lightly armed Chinese to retreat. But the price of this Japanese victory had been high. 20,000 crack soldiers were dead, and a few thousand more were too badly wounded to ever return to the fight. Chung made a statement to the world. China was committed to fighting to the bitter end. While it was contained within Chinese territory, the war had global dimensions. High above the hand-to-hand fighting on the ground, pilots from the Soviet Union and the United States flew alongside Chinese aviators in German-made Heinkels and Messerschmitts. These three great industrial nations managed to put aside their differences to fight together against the Japanese in support of nationalist China. Individuals in the United States launched fundraising campaigns to help out the Chinese forces and attempted to lobby the US government to cut ties with Japan. A horde of Chinese American mechanics and drivers even crossed the Pacific to set up a military logistics network. Until 1938, Germany was training and equipping the cream of China's forces. These became the core of China's military and made up the majority of the men who fought to defend Shanghai. When the city was eventually lost, so were the best trained Chinese soldiers, along with their German-made gear. The loss of these crack troops was keenly felt, and by late 1938, China had not only lost Shanghai, but the capital Nanjing and most other major cities as well. The battle lines were drawn, and they wouldn't change until 1944. But in the meantime, the Allied commanders knew they absolutely had to keep China in the fight. Why? Because from 1937 to 1945, Japan never had more than 20% of its army outside of China. During the entire Pacific campaign, the Allies never faced more than 1/5 of the Japanese army's total strength. Just imagine how the war may have gone if China hadn't tied down the bulk of Japanese forces. Between 1932 and 1939, the Soviet Union was at war. The Imperial Japanese Army had set up shop in Manchuria and was making repeated forays into Soviet allied Mongolia. Wholeheartedly believing their leaders' ridiculous ideas of ethno-racial superiority, the Japanese army thought invading the region would be a piece of cake. What they didn't count on was their adversary, the nomadic Mongolian horsemen, putting up a fight worthy of their great forefather Genghis Khan. Early in the morning of September 18th, 1931, Japanese artillery shells started raining down onto a unit of Chinese conscripts in Mukden, now Shenyang in Manchuria. The attack was organized by two Imperial Japanese Army colonels acting on their own without orders from their superiors. The attack was successful and kicked off a chain reaction among the other Japanese forces in Manchuria. The largest force, the Kwantung Army, launched a major campaign that eventually led to the complete capture of Manchuria by Japan. The politicians back home were outraged, but what could they do? Their government could only remain in power with the support of the army, and unpopular Japanese leaders had a habit of getting assassinated in the 1930s too. But why did the colonels take such a sensational risk? Resources. They knew northern China, Mongolia, and Siberia were rich in the mineral resources that Japan lacked, and the only solution they could see was invasion. Over in Moscow, Stalin was worried. Russia's historic defeat in the Russo-Japanese War less than 30 years earlier had been a serious factor in toppling the Tsar's regime. By the 1930s, the Bolsheviks were finally consolidating their power, and another defeat at the hands of Japan would certainly throw a spanner in the works. Quietly, Stalin sent Red Army units to the Far East. These units were ordered to bolster the newly formed Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army, a predominantly cavalry force of rugged partisans and nomads. By mid-1935, the Kwantung Army had consolidated its hold in Manchuria, but its leaders weren't content with what they had. They were looking north, and the Mongols were staring right back at them. The same day the Kwantung Army militarized the border between Manchuria and Mongolia, skirmishes began. The Japanese were preparing to expand their territory north and launched many small probing attacks to test Mongolian strength and resolve. The Mongolians, on the other hand, weren't used to petty borders separating them from traditional grazing lands or fishing spots. The fact that the Japanese hated them crossing the border to reach these areas only made the proud horsemen do it more. On one occasion, Japanese soldiers masquerading as surveyors crossed into Mongolia to scope out the enemy and the landscape. They were equipped with rifles and several machine guns, which was rare in this early stage of the war. A Mongolian scout spied the Japanese from a hill and reported it to his commander. Before the Japanese could get their tripods out, Mongolian cavalry came charging over the hills. They were armed with Russian-made Mosin-Nagant rifles and Degtyaryov light machine guns, but in this sort of fight, their traditional curved swords were most effective. Their short, stocky, and incredibly rugged horses were genetically identical to those ridden by the hordes of Genghis Khan, and as it turned out, they worked just as well against the Japanese. The survey party was annihilated and their bodies taken back to the Japanese side of the border. This was considered a sign of respect and became common practice after Mongolian victories and after some Soviet ones too. On another occasion, the Mongolian crew of a Soviet steamboat stole a large supply of fishing equipment from a Japanese depot near the border. Unwilling to provoke Stalin, Japanese diplomats only issued low-level complaints to the Soviet embassy. The Soviet response was as sarcastic as it was unambiguous. The Japanese could avoid such difficulties if they returned to Japan. Naturally, this didn't go down all that well, and Japanese high-ups began sending constraint requests to their government for more men and supplies to pacify the lawless borderlands. As time wore on, each side was bringing more and more soldiers to each fight, and they were better and better armed. Among the hundreds of small-scale skirmishes fought along the border before 1938 were a handful of serious engagements. One of these was the Battle of Khalkhin Temple, fought on January 8, 1935. 100 Mongolian cavalrymen ambushed a Japanese army column. They managed to kill 11 soldiers, but took horrendous casualties from a well-positioned machine gun nest. 23 Mongolians, including the commander, were killed. The surviving horsemen fought so hard that the Japanese broke and ran, abandoning their position. The Japanese lost serious respect in the eyes of the Mongolian and Soviet forces, but they quickly saw a way to gain it back. On March 11, 1936, 100 Mongolian cavalrymen and 6 Soviet advisors attacked the border village of Tauron. They quickly overpowered the Japanese allied defenders, but word of the attack managed to get out. Later that day, over 400 Imperial Japanese Army troops, along with Manchurian volunteers, arrived with armored support and several squadrons of aircraft. Their goal was to retake the village at all costs. Overnight, the Japanese aircraft flew bombing run after bombing run in an effort to soften up the defenders. Many horses were killed, and this seriously hampered the Mongolians' mobility. In the morning, the Japanese advanced with tanks supported by infantry. The Mongolians had some light machine guns, but virtually no anti-tank weapons. They did minimal damage to the Japanese armor before they were forced to retreat, leaving behind over a quarter of their initial force dead. The Japanese retook Tauron, and the Mongolians learnt a valuable lesson. Don't bring a sword to a tank fight. Next time, it would be different. On May 11th, 1939, a Mongolian cavalry force of around 80 horsemen crossed into the Khalkha River to graze their horses. a Japanese allied Manchurian cavalry unit surprised the Mongolians and pushed them back over the river. 2 days later, the Mongolians came back with another 100 horsemen and this time defeated the Manchurians. Fed up with their underlings' failures, the Imperial Japanese Army decided to take matters into their own hands. On May 14th, 2 regiments of infantry attacked the Mongolians, forcing them to withdraw. But 2 weeks later, they came back, and this time they had several Soviet regiments with them. Together, the Mongolians and Soviets surrounded the Japanese and utterly destroyed them. Both sides knew the campaign's decisive battle was approaching and brought massive reinforcements to Khalkhin-Gol. On the Japanese side were 30,000 soldiers, 92 tanks and tankettes, 300 artillery pieces and 200 warplanes. The Soviets had moved in over 61,000 soldiers, 2,000 Mongolian cavalrymen, 500 tanks, 400 armored cars, 600 artillery pieces and 580 warplanes. In charge of this immense force was an up-and-coming staff officer who was beginning to show some serious strategic skill, Corps Commander Zhukov. His second-in-command was Corps Commissar Lakvusoren of the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Army. It took a month for the Japanese commander to receive permission to attack, which, uncharacteristically, he waited for. The planners in Tokyo wanted to wait until the Kwantung Army had massed even more troops, but they also knew that every day they waited, more enemy soldiers arrived on trains from Moscow. 2 Japanese detachments broke off from the main army and attacked on the night of July 2nd, 1939. The first detachment consisted of 3.5 infantry regiments and aimed to take Bansagun Hill on the river's west bank. The second detachment consisted of all the Japanese tanks and had no infantry support. They aimed to smash through Soviet defenses and swing round to link up with the infantry, thereby encircling the Soviets. The first part of the plan worked fine, with the Japanese infantry pushing the Soviets off Bansagun Hill. But then things fell apart. Zhukov immediately realized what the Japanese were trying to do and counterattacked with tanks and armored cars. The Japanese infantry would have been fully encircled had they not beat a hasty retreat over the river. On their flank, Soviet infantry and artillery smashed the Japanese armor, which, without infantry support, was nearly totally destroyed. In the subsequent few weeks, both sides dug in. The Soviets had suffered far more casualties than the Japanese, but they were far more easily replaced. The Japanese, on the other hand, were facing critical supply shortages. Zhukov may have been content to wait the Japanese out, but Stalin wasn't. War in Europe was looming, and the USSR's crack troops would be no use confined to the Mongolian steppe. On August 20th, Zhukov launched his final offensive. He motorized 2 full infantry divisions with supply trucks and paired them with 2 Mongolian cavalry divisions and 2 tank divisions. The resultant force was highly mobile and packed a heavy punch, but it was a gamble. If Zhukov's assault failed, he would lose his trucks and his army would very rapidly run out of food and ammunition. But sometimes you've got to take a gamble to win big, and that's exactly what happened here. The Soviet assault quickly encircled the Japanese 23rd Division and pushed all other Japanese elements out of Mongolia. The Kwantung Army tried again and again to break through and relieve their comrades, but to no avail. The Soviets bombarded the encircled 23rd Division until it was virtually wiped out. The Japanese were pushed from Mongolia and the Kwantung Army was broken, never to recover from their losses at Khalkhin-Gol. The US Army Rangers have an epic reputation, and it all started with one of the most dangerous units of the Second World War, Merrill's Marauders. Officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit, Merrill's Marauders were an all-volunteer force of 3,000 men from across the US Army. Their namesake commander, Brigadier General Merrill, wanted to hit the Japanese supply lines in Burma with a long-range force of elite jungle troops. He got his wish in February 1944. The lightly armed Marauders weren't weighed down by heavy support weapons and they excelled in launching swift attacks to cut off Japanese supply lines. They were experts in mobile warfare and always inflicted more casualties than they took. But it wasn't long before the Marauders started taking significant casualties, with tropical diseases eroding their combat strength from the inside. In April of 1944, the increasingly worn-out soldiers were ordered to defend a jungle village. This was an operation they were not cut out for, and casualties mounted. The exhaustion and half-starved Marauders won the battle, only to be ordered on a 100-kilometer march over the Kumon Mountains to attack the lightly defended Myitkyina airfield. Military intelligence lived up to its reputation, and the 1,300 surviving Marauders attacked 4,600 well-armed Japanese defenders. The airfield was taken with support from the Chinese army, but the Marauders were decimated. By August 1944, only 6 months after entering Burma, the original 2,750 Marauders had been cut down to only 130 combat effective soldiers, the rest being killed or evacuated due to wounds and disease. This last military unit threw that logic out of the window, aiming to die and take as many enemies with them as possible. We're talking, of course, about the Japanese kamikazes. Mostly novice pilots aged between 17 and 25, kamikazes had to volunteer to fly their suicide missions, but the pressure from their friends and commanders often made it impossible to say no. They were placed in a special attack unit and commanded by an experienced pilot who would lead them to their target. The first planned kamikaze mission took place in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. 55 kamikazes attacked the US carrier fleet, hitting 47 ships and sinking 5. This was seen as a huge success, and the special attack units were expanded, launching over 2,000 attacks over the next few months. Also, many Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their planes into Allied ships after they had been severely damaged. While not part of special attack units, these kamikaze attacks still inflicted casualties on the Allied navies. It's hard to say for sure, but research shows that 57 Allied ships were sunk and 368 were damaged by 2,800 kamikaze attackers throughout the war, while 4,900 sailors were killed and 4,800 were wounded. None of the kamikazes who reached their destinations obviously survived. Used only a handful of times throughout the war, midget submarine missions were considered so dangerous that the crews always wrote goodbye letters to their families before they set out. Only 24 meters long and with a maximum dive depth of 30 meters, these tiny two-man submarines were designed for sneak attacks inside enemy harbors. As far as we know, these attacks only occurred 3 times during the war, in Pearl Harbor, Sydney, and Madagascar. Due to the secrecy of their deployment and unreliable records, it's possible more midget submarine missions were launched, but none of the attackers ever reached their targets. Of the 5 subs launched in the Pearl Harbor attack, only 2 definitely made it in. Their orders were to launch their 2 torpedoes and then blow themselves up. Even though a rough plan was made to pick up the crews, they were aware it was a suicide mission. Only 1 crewman of a midget submarine was known to have survived. Ensign Sakamaki, the commander of one of the submarines that attacked Pearl Harbor. Captured after failing to scuttle his vessel, Sakamaki was seen by those back in Japan as a coward and a traitor for not committing suicide. In the first part of this series, we discussed Merrill's Marauders, the precursors to the US Army Rangers, and their operations in Burma. Brigadier General Merrill himself was inspired by the exploits of the Chindits, a long-range penetration special forces unit of the British Indian Army. The Chindits were sent into Burma twice. The first time, in February of 1943, they only managed to temporarily disable a railway and harass Japanese troops. The terrain was inhospitable and constant Japanese attacks inflicted massive casualties. Of the 3,000 who marched in, 818 were killed and another 600 were too badly wounded to return to the fight. British command, however, wasn't put off by such a large loss of Indian life and sent a far larger force of Chindits back in February of 1944. The second operation was much better prepared, but the Japanese were ready. Flown in close to their objectives, the Chindits were soon in fierce combat. Some engagements were close quarters, kukri-armed Indians squaring up against katana-wielding Japanese. Eventually fighting their way out, the Chindits were ordered to assault several well-defended Japanese positions. Armed only with light weapons, the Chindits suffered heavy losses. Attrition from disease was also very high, and as the weeks wore on, their position was increasingly unstable. The Chindits were pulled out of Burma in July, but not before another 1,396 were killed and 2,434 were wounded. Finally, we have the Courage Division, a nickname for the Imperial Japanese Army's 109th Division. This unit was tasked with the last-ditch defense of Iwo Jima from February to March 1945. The island contained an airbase in bombing range of Tokyo, therefore making it critical for Japan's defense. The garrison force were veterans of the war in China and commanded by the expert strategist General Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi prepared his defense well, digging tunnels across the island and concealing his heavy guns inside a hill. He waited until the beaches were crowded with US Marines and equipment before opening fire. Expecting a banzai charge, the US Marines were caught unprepared and took massive casualties. Undersupplied and without air or naval support, the defense of Iwo Jima was doomed from the start. General Kuribayashi led the final charge himself, choosing to die with his men instead of committing suicide in his bunker. Of the 109th Division's 21,000 troops, roughly 18,500 were killed. 2,000 to 3,000 held out in the tunnels once the battle was lost. Taking no chances, US Marines entombed most of these holdouts by blowing up the tunnel exits. About a year before George Albert Cairns joined the British Army, he was working at a bank in Kent, England. By March 1944, he was a lieutenant in the Somerset Light Infantry Regiment, which had been attached to the Chindits South Staffordshire Regiment in Burma. On the 16th, the unit established positions within the site of a Japanese-held pagoda standing on top of a hill in the Hinu Block in British Burma. They soon realized there was a Japanese position very near to them too, with neither force having been aware of the other when they set up camp. Soon after the British discovered the nearby Japanese position, the Japanese in the pagoda opened fire. In response, the British launched an assault on the hill. In British officer Michael Calvert's words, "At the top of the hill, an extraordinary melee took place. Everyone shooting, bayoneting, kicking at everyone else." One of the men participating in this assault was our boy George Albert Cairns, and Calvert watched with his own eyes as a Japanese soldier rushed Cairns with a sword, hacking his arm all but completely off. Unfazed by the loss of his limb, Cairns shot his assailant, took his sword, and then led his men deeper into the fray, swinging the sword with his one good arm. According to another British officer who must have witnessed Cairns' savagery a short while after Calvert, George, Cairns and a Jap were struggling on the ground. I saw George break free and, picking up a rifle bayonet, stab the again and again like a madman. It was only when I got near that I saw he himself had already been bayoneted twice through the side and that his left arm was hanging on by a few strips of muscle. How he had found the strength to fight was a miracle, but the effort had been too much and he died the next morning. Born in Victoria, Australia in 1916, Leslie Allen had a rough childhood, marred with domestic violence and abandonment. Throughout his teenage years, he laboured on farms and got huge. In 1940, when Allen was in his early 20s, he signed up for the 2nd Australian Imperial Force of the Australian Army and was designated as a stretcher bearer. While serving in the Middle East, he played a bit of recreational footy with his battalion, during which his bull-like charges at his opposition earned him the nickname Bull. By early 1943, he was participating in the New Guinea Campaign against the Japanese. In the mountainous jungles, Bull often forewent his stretcher, opting to sling wounded Allied soldiers over his shoulder instead. He did this time and time again, often under intense Japanese fire and with hardly any concern for his own safety. For his deeds at Crystal Creek on the 7th and 8th of February, he received the Military Medal. For his actions at the Battle of Mount Tambu in late July, he was awarded the Silver Star. On Mount Tambu, Bull charged into the fray no fewer than a dozen times, shouldering 12 American soldiers to safety before collapsing from exhaustion. In the words of Bull's friend David Crenage, each time he went back for another rescue attempt, soldiers would make bets on whether he would return. Young Qingyu was born in Tuishan County, China in 1905 and involved himself with the Communist Party of China as a youth, soon after which he was organizing communist revolutionary forces against the Republic of China and then also the Japanese. In February 1936, in the lead up to the Second Sino-Japanese War, Young was made the commander of the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army, 1st Army. Throughout the next few years, the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army fought against the Japanese in Manchukuo using guerrilla tactics. By 1938, Young allegedly had a 10,000 yuan bounty on his head, and by early 1940, with the Second Sino-Japanese War blending into the Second World War, things were looking pretty grim for Young and his men. His numbers had taken a serious hit, and some 40,000 Japanese troops were now closing the noose on those that remained. To try and break out of the encirclement, Young ordered his men to split up. In February though, the Japanese figured out where Young and his detachment of 60 men were hiding, focusing their energies on hunting him down and claiming that bounty. Young's detachment was whittled away, and soon only Young was left standing. Much to the surprise of the Japanese, however, Young continued to wage war on his lonesome, surviving in the forest for an additional 5 days. When they finally gunned him down, they cut off and preserved his head before conducting an autopsy on his headless body. Studying his gut, they learned that Young, the absolute madman, China has steely soldiers like young Qingyu, and it would not fall. With the Netherlands getting stomped by Germany early in the Second World War, the contribution of the Dutch to the Allied cause can sometimes go a little under the radar. In reality, the Dutch pressed the fight in the Netherlands and elsewhere in the world, operating under commands based in other Allied countries. The Dutch Royal Navy in particular was a formidable military branch with the proud. In fact, the Dutch Royal Navy fought like hell in the Pacific War, especially in the waters surrounding modern-day Indonesia. In this video, we're going to provide an overview of the Dutch Royal Navy's involvement in World War II, focusing mostly on its exploits in the Pacific. In a classic Der Führer play by Adolf Hitler, he drove his war machine into the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940, forcing the Dutch military surrender just 5 days later. Rather than simply gifting them to Hitler, the Dutch Royal Navy moved as many of its naval vessels out of their port as they could, sending them to relative safety in Britain. For the rest of the war, that portion of the Dutch Navy operated alongside the Allies around Europe, participating in the evacuation at Dunkirk and the Normandy landings, to name just a couple of operations. Of course, empires were all the rage back then, and the Dutch were totally aboard that train with their rule on what was then the Dutch East Indies, and is now Indonesia. In defense of the Dutch East Indies, 4 Dutch cruisers, 7 Dutch destroyers, 15 Dutch submarines, and a whole lot of Dutch ovens were stationed in the Javan city of Surabaya. The Dutch also maintained a force of at least 5 submarines in Western Australia. While the Dutch Navy was involved in quite a few scuffles in the Dutch East Indies campaign and beyond, we're going to keep our focus on some hot submarine action at the start of the campaign, the Battle of the Java Sea and the Battle of the Sunda Strait. Just before World War II kicked off, a Dutch admiral by the name of Conrad Helfrich was put in charge of all Dutch naval forces in the Dutch East Indies. Shortly after the Pacific War got off to an explosive start with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Helfrich was ordered to stick it hard and fast to the Japanese, especially Japanese supply lines. Making good use of his Western Australia-based subs, he sunk 54 Japanese vessels in the first 54 days of the Pacific War, earning himself the nickname of Ship-a-Day Helfrich. To put that in perspective, he sunk more Japanese vessels in the first few weeks than the British Navy and the American Navy combined. Early in January 1942, Allied Command gave birth to the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, or ABDACOM, the supreme command for all Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. While command of the naval component of ABDACOM, ABDAFLOAT, went first to an American admiral, It passed to our Dutch buddy Helfrich on the 12th of February, just in time for the hands-down most disastrous naval battle of the Dutch East Indies campaign. Operating under the command of Admiral Helfrich, Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman was put in charge of an Abdervloot force which included most of the Dutch Royal Army's warships as well as some British, American and Australian vessels. Doorman, while not super keen on Helfrich's balls to the wall strategy himself, was tasked with leading an almost kamikaze headfirst offensive against the Imperial Japanese Navy. On the 17th of February 1942, Doorman's strike force, composed of 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers and 9 destroyers, departed Surabaya, Java. His objective was to intercept and destroy a Japanese convoy. As Doorman engaged the Japanese Navy in the Java Sea, he learned very quickly that he was hilariously outgunned. Each time the Dutch-led strike force attempted to penetrate the Japanese convoy, the convoy's escort force would lay absolute waste to the Allied ships, all but obliterating the strike force within the span of a day. Late in the night, Doorman's flagship, the HMAS Yarra, was struck by a long-lance torpedo and dressed in flames. The ship's electrical systems were char-grilled, and the crew were unable to stop Yarra from burning and flooding. While Doorman had the privilege of being rescued, he decided to go down with his ship instead, which sunk below the waves around 3 hours after getting the torpedo hit, taking 367 sailors and Doorman with it. The few warships which survived tried to flee, some to other places in the Dutch East Indies, some to Australia, and some all the way to Ceylon. Unfortunately, most of them were destroyed as they limped away, as was the case for 1 American heavy cruiser, 1 Australian light cruiser, and 1 Dutch destroyer in what came to be known as the Battle of Sunda Strait. Wounded in the Battle of the Java Sea, the American USS Houston, Australian HMAS Perth, and Dutch HNLMS Evertston were giving it legs through the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, having fallen under the de facto command of Royal Australian Navy officer Hector Waller. He did quite well considering the hand that was dealt to him. As a result of poor intel, his tiny ragtag force stumbled upon a Japanese invasion convoy of more than 50 transport ships escorted by at least a dozen warships. Surrounded, Waller had no choice but to go down fighting, emptying every shell aboard the HMAS Perth. In the chaos which ensued, Japanese friendly fire sunk a troop transport ship, wounded 3 more transports, and sunk a minesweeper. Of course, Houston, Perth, and Everston went down too, taking over 1,000 sailors, including Waller, with them. The 675 Allied sailors who survived the Battle of Sunda Strait were taken as prisoners of war. All in all, 10 of the 14 warships which entered the Battle of the Java Sea were destroyed during the battle, all while trying to flee it. The Japanese took the island of Java shortly after. By the 1st of March, Abdicom was dissolved, and the enemy had a firm grip on the Dutch East Indies overall, winning the campaign on the 9th of March 1942. While the Dutch Navy's surface vessels were all but obliterated, its submarines were able to get out of Java and continue operations in the Pacific. Hunting down Japanese tankers out of Western Australia, the Dutch became known as the 4th ally in the Allied campaigns in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, along with the Aussies, Kiwis, and Yanks. The Dutch submarine HNLMS Zwaardvis was the most successful of these submarines, sinking a range of Axis vessels, including, but not limited to, Japanese transports, mine layers, and guard boats, and the German submarine U-168, which it torpedoed in October 1944 off Java. While this was by no means a comprehensive list of every scrap the Dutch Royal Navy took part of in the Pacific, it might now be obvious to you that the Dutch fought like hell. In February 1942, the last remnants of the Dutch East Indies were falling to the Japanese onslaught. The Dutch commander, Admiral Helfrich, marshaled his naval forces for a final defense of his homeland. He ordered his last ships, the cruisers USS Houston and HMAS Perth, commanded by the celebrated Australian Captain Waller, to force a passage through the Sunda Strait, declaring, "You must continue attacks until the enemy is destroyed." Outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed by an entire Japanese invasion fleet, Waller had one choice: attack. This is the story of the Battle of Sunda Strait and the last stand of Australia's greatest sea captain. Before the Australians and Japanese had started fighting in the Pacific, Captain Hector Waller had earned himself a reputation. Commanding the scrap iron ship HMAS Stewart in the Mediterranean Sea, Waller played a key role in the decisive Battle of Cape Matapan as well as the resupply of besieged troops in Tobruk. Admiral Cunningham, the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Theatre, described Waller as one of the finest types of Australian naval officers, greatly loved and admired by everyone. During a visit by the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies to the Commonwealth Naval Base at Alexandria, Cunningham said, "And now you're going to meet one of the greatest captains who ever sailed the seas. His name is Waller." Such praise was not undeserved. While he had a firm grasp of naval tactics and strategy, Waller was first and foremost a man of the sea. Ship handling was his calling, and he epitomized the Royal Australian Navy, drive it like you stole it. During the campaign in the Mediterranean, Stewart often came under attack by Axis dive bombers. While other captains would hurriedly shout orders to escape and evade, Waller remained cool and collected. He would stand outside on the bridge wing and wait for the enemy aircraft to release their bombs. Then, once he saw the planes pull out of their dives, he would order hard A port or hard A starboard. This was the order for the helmsman to turn the wheel as far as it would go, and Stewart would list heavily to one side as she came around. Evading bombs like this required nerves of steel, which Waller had in abundance. Stewart was never crippled by a bomb, and the crew affectionately nicknamed their captain Hard Over Heck. In August 1941, Stewart and the scrap iron flotilla returned to Australia for some rest and a much needed refit. Waller was promoted and given command of the larger and more heavily armed cruiser HMAS Perth. Perth was a significant upgrade from Stewart. She had 8 6-inch guns, 8 4-inch guns, and 8 torpedo tubes, as well as a full complement of 622 officers and sailors. Ships like these were sorely needed in the Pacific, where the Imperial Japanese Navy were inflicting defeat after defeat on the Allies. In January 1942, Perth was assigned to Abda Command. This unit was a mixture of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships under the overall command of Dutch Admiral Doorman. Its headquarters was the island of Java in what was then called the Dutch East Indies. Java had been a Dutch colonial holding for 3 centuries, and the Dutch were committed to defending it, especially since the Netherlands had already been annexed by the Third Reich. Perth reached the Abda fleet, but before she had been there a week, catastrophe struck. Aerial recon alerted Doorman to the presence of a Japanese amphibious invasion fleet en route to Java. In response, he mobilized his entire fleet and steamed north from Surabaya to take the fight to the enemy. The combined striking force comprised 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Ahead of them lay 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Bad weather meant neither side could establish air superiority. Unfortunately for the Abda fleet, Japanese gunnery was superior. The battle lasted from midday to late evening, and in that time, Doorman repeatedly attempted to smash through the Japanese line. Each time he was repulsed and more valuable ships were sunk. At 11 PM, he made a final effort. His own flagship, HMNLS De Ruyter, led the charge and was blown to pieces by Japanese torpedoes. Doorman went down with it. Seeing nothing but devastation and certain death ahead of him, Waller took charge. He ordered the other remaining ship, USS Houston, to follow him and set course for Java. Both ships were almost out of ammunition and fuel, but they escaped with only minor damage. The Japanese decisively won the Battle of the Java Sea, but they had not seen the last of HMAS Perth, USS Houston, and Captain Waller. With Doorman dead, Abda Command passed to Admiral Helfrich. Born and raised in Java, Helfrich embodied the Dutch colonial spirit. A front-page article from the March 1942 issue of Time magazine describes his character, stating, "To Helfrich, as to all true colonial Dutchmen, these islands were home in a sense that Holland could never be. Java was all the Dutch had left of the Indies." His situation was hopeless. With Doorman dead and most of the Abda fleet lying at the bottom of the Java Sea, Helfrich had nothing left to withstand the Japanese invasion. But he was fighting for his home and the last remnants of an almost conquered empire. Emotion clouded his judgment. On February 28th, Perth and Houston arrived at the Javanese port of Tanjung Priok. The ships were in desperate need of supplies, but the harbour master refused them. Helfrich had ordered all remaining ammunition stocks and fuel supplies be reserved for Dutch ships and only Dutch ships. Even 6-inch and 4-inch shells, which Dutch guns weren't chambered for, were withheld from Perth and Houston. Waller was furious and got stuck into Helfrich. After some persuasion, the harbour master agreed to fill Perth's fuel tanks halfway and Houston's 1/3. This wasn't even enough fuel for the US ship to return home, but it was all the Dutch would give. After refusing them resupply, Helfrich ordered Waller to transit the Sunda Strait to Chilat Jap on Java's south coast. He gave the Aussie captain an aerial intelligence report from 1600 showing no Japanese shipping in the area, but this was a lie. On Helfrich's desk lay an aerial intelligence report from 1700 that clearly showed several Japanese warships making for Sunda Strait. It's unclear whether Helfrich knew he was sending Waller into the jaws of a Japanese fleet or whether he simply forgot to tell him. Whichever the case, Waller's fate was sealed. As darkness closed in on the night of February 28th, Perth and Houston made their way into Sunda Strait. 2 hours behind them was the Dutch destroyer HMNLS Evertsen, but she couldn't make sufficient speed to catch up with the Australian and American cruisers. At 23:06, while crossing Banton Bay, Perth sighted a ship. Waller initially assumed it was an Australian corvette, but when she was challenged, the ship responded by firing a spread of torpedoes. Satisfied with this answer, Waller gave the order for Perth and Houston to open fire. By sheer luck, the entire Japanese 16th Army was loaded in 50 transport ships and entering Banton Bay at exactly the same time. They were escorted by a light carrier, a seaplane carrier, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and several mine layers. Perth had been spotted by Japanese destroyer Harukatse, which reported the contact to the fleet commander, Vice Admiral Kurita. Knowing the vulnerability of the transports, he ordered all his ships to attack. Shells screamed overhead and torpedoes tore cloudy wakes through the water. From the bridge, Waller threw Perth from port to starboard, narrowly avoiding the incoming ordnance. His gun crews rapidly burnt through their entire ammunition stockpile, then switched to firing whatever was left. Perth fired illumination rounds, then smoke shells, then practice rounds, then finally her guns went silent. Putting the engines into overdrive, Waller streaked towards open water. Gunners on Perth's upper decks were firing at the Japanese with leveled anti-aircraft guns and the ship's 50 cal machine guns, but they weren't nearly out of ammo too. A little past midnight, Perth took a torpedo hit on the starboard side. Against all odds, Waller managed to steady her. There were enemy ships in every direction, but he refused to give up. With orders of harder port, harder starboard, hard over heck dodged salvo after salvo. But with each hit, Perth slowed down and was less able to answer her helm. Before long, Perth took another torpedo hit and started going down. Waller gave the order to abandon ship just before a high explosive shell hit the bridge, instantly killing the crew. Ammunition supplies completely expended and taking on water from 4 torpedo hits, Perth sank. Behind her, Houston had been fighting just as hard and was facing the same odds. Flames raged on her deck, but her guns were still firing. With Perth going down, Japanese fire focused on Houston and she was torn apart by torpedoes. Her commander, Captain Rooks, was killed, but not before he managed to land a few devastating salvos. During the battle, the Japanese launched 85 torpedoes, primarily aimed at the lead ship Perth. Hard over heck had lived up to his name, dodging them with expert ship handling. 1,103 crewmen from Perth and Houston were killed, while 678 were taken as POWs. Together, Waller and Rooks sank 4 transports and damaged a cruiser and 3 destroyers. Brothers in arms, Captain Waller and Captain Rooks had fought to the last shell, torpedo, and bullet against an overwhelming enemy force. For his heroic action, Rooks was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Likewise, Waller was recommended for the Victoria Cross, but he didn't get it. His previous commander, Admiral Cunningham, was dismayed by the death of Australia's best captain. He later said, "Waller will always remain one of the very finest types of Australian naval officer. Full of good cheer, undefeated and always burning to get at the enemy. The Collins-class submarine HMAS Yarra was named in his honor. That was the courageous story of Captain Yarra of HMAS Perth, Captain Rooks of USS Houston, and a tooth-and-nail fight to stay afloat in the Sunda Strait. Despite its early wins, Imperial Japan's fanaticism and brutality could not carry it through to victory in the war. Poor decision-making and infighting plagued the Japanese military. Where other armies would have cut their losses and retreated, living to fight another day, the Japanese army pressed on, throwing logic by the wayside. Lacking supplies and medicine, the Japanese, more than once, stretched themselves too thin and crumbled as a result. Instead of surrendering, they often fought to the death, rushing their enemies in reckless banzai attacks. And if they couldn't do that, there was always suicide. The China-Burma-India theatre was one of the most atrocious theatres of the Second World War, due in no part to Japanese savagery. This theatre was also the site of one of Japan's biggest undoings. In this video, we delve into the Japanese blunder that was the Yugo offensive, focusing on the battles of Imphal and Kohima. At the onset of World War II, Burma was part of the British Empire, because what wasn't? In December 1941, the Japanese 15th Army, led by Lieutenant General Shojiro Lida, advanced through friendly Thailand on Burma's port capital, Rangoon. They bombed the hell out of the city, then marched in, driving out the surviving forces of Britain, British India, and British Burma by early March the following year. After Rangoon's fall, the forces of the British Empire teamed up with the Chinese in central Burma to staunch Japan's spread through Burma. Long story short, it didn't work, and the Allies limped to relative safety in neighbouring India and China. The forces of the British Empire mostly took refuge in the Indian state of Manipur, notably the city of Imphal. From then until March 1944, the Japanese set up shop in Burma, seizing control of the country and working alongside the collaborationist Burma Independence Army. As for the British, once they were done licking their wounds, they tested Japanese resolve with an offense on Burma's Arakan province. It was a disaster, with the British taking heavy casualties. They also tried a less direct approach, creating British and Indian Spec Ops units known as the Long Range Penetration Groups, or Chindits. These units went deep behind enemy lines to engage the Japanese using guerrilla tactics. While the Chindits saw some success, Burma's jungle wore them down and ate them alive. Of the 9,000 to 12,000 Chindits to serve in Burma, 1,400 were killed and over 2,400 were wounded. A great many of them spent time hospitalized as well, suffering from disease and malnutrition. Meanwhile, the US was improving transportation and communication a little further into India than Imphal, namely in the state of Assam. Among their larger projects, they flew supplies from American air bases in Assam to American air bases in China over the Himalayan mountains. They were also busy constructing the Doolittle Raid, another vital link between India and China. Both of these efforts would help America and China fight the Japanese in Burma. So naturally, the Japanese weren't too chuffed about it. In March 1943, a bloke named Renya Motoguchi took charge of the Japanese 15th Army, while the rest of Japan's forces in Burma fell under the Burma Area Army. As for Motoguchi, he dreamt of invading Assam every night and woke up with a rager every morning, so he came up with a foolproof plan. Basically, he would take the 15th Army and thrust it into India. The bulk of his army would penetrate Imphal, while the 31st Infantry Division, under Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, would gank Kohima to Imphal's north, severing the Allied supply line. Regarding the 15th Army's own supplies, that wouldn't be a problem. Motoguchi's men could sustain themselves on the thrill of battle alone. Motoguchi agreed with himself in the mirror that it was a great plan indeed. The greatest. It didn't matter that his divisional commanders thought otherwise. Other than his reflection, Gucci also boasted the support of Subhas C. Bose and Bose's collaborationist Indian National Army in turn. Now, all that Gucci needed was a name. Operation Yugo would do. Defending the Indian cities was the British 14th Army, a British and British Indian unit under the command of Lieutenant General William Slim, who had spent a lot of time and money preparing his men for war, and whose game plan was to withdraw to the Imphal plain and stretch the Japanese supply lines thin as pasta. Gucci crossed the Chinwin River on the 8th of March 1944, several days before the British had expected. This resulted in a bit of a messy withdrawal, with the predominantly Indian divisions making a fighting withdrawal to the Imphal plain, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese, but suffering a great many in turn. At one point, the city of Imphal was left all but completely open to the Japanese 15th Division. Unfortunately for Gucci, who really could have used the win, Slim was able to fly 2 brigades of the 5th Indian Infantry Division, jeeps and all, into Imphal and save the day. With the city denied, Gucci lost what momentum he'd built. From April, he was forced to make ineffectual attacks against the 14th Army on the Imphal plain. Meanwhile, Kotoku Sato's 31st Infantry Division had reached Kohima, coming up against the Assam Regiment and some of the platoons of the Assam Rifles. Despite being outnumbered, the regiment fought a successful rearguard action from the 1st of April to the 4th, when 2 battalions of the Indian 161st Brigade arrived in Kohima, where some Chindit and Nepalese Gurkha units had also gathered. Much of the fighting took place on Kohima Ridge, and certainly the bloodiest occurred over control of British Deputy Commissioner Charles Pawsey's bungalow and tennis court. In fact, the battle for the World War I-esque no man's land that was the tennis court devolved into a savage melee, punctuated with sniper bullets and bayonet attacks. According to Major Boschel of the British 6th Brigade, which relieved the 161st, the land made impossible to move by day because of Japanese snipers. We were in Kohima for 3 weeks. We were attacked every single night. They came in waves. It was like a pigeon shoot. Also brought in to relieve Kohima's initial defenders was the British 5th Brigade, a unit of the same division as the 6th. Bolstered by these units, the British fought tooth and nail to remove the Japanese from Kohima Ridge and then the villages surrounding Kohima. One of such villages was Nagar village. By mid-May, Sato's supply lines were non-existent and his men were starving. They tried to forage as much as they could from the surrounding hills, but it wasn't enough. To top it off, the warehouse full of rice they had hoped to seize had earlier been bombed and consequentially obliterated. To top it off again, Gucci now wanted Sato to drag the remnants of his sorry division to Imphal, where things were going equally as terrible for the Gooch. Sato's men, starving, sick and wounded, dropped off the perch as they moved south, while the British Indian 33rd Corps, which had come to relieve the British at Kohima, gave the Japanese division a not-so-gentle nudge from behind, simultaneously advancing on Imphal. Beginning in May, Imphal's defenders began a counter-offensive against the Japanese, who were exhausted from attacking over the Imphal plain and whose supplies were wearing thin, just as Slim had expected. The 33rd Corps hit the Japanese from the north, while south of Imphal, the 17th Indian Division broke apart the Japanese 33rd Division throughout May and June. On the 3rd of July, the Gooch took another good hard look at himself in the mirror and decided it was over, ordering the dregs of his army to withdraw. All in all, the Japanese 15th Army suffered some 55,000 to 60,000 casualties in Big G's Yugo offensive, including over 13,000 deaths, mostly due to starvation, exhaustion, and disease. The 12,000 pack horses and mules and 30,000 cattle the Gooch had sent into the fray were all but extinct, destroyed by the British or devoured by the Japanese. The Gooch sacked all of his divisional commanders before he got sacked himself, and the tide had well and truly turned in the favour of the Allies in the Burma Campaign and the China-Burma-India theatre overall. Despite what his name suggests, American Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle did a whole lot for the Western Allies in the Second World War, planning and participating in one of the most audacious aerial raids in all human history, among other things. In this video, we're going to focus on said raid, providing you with an overview of the operation and some of the messed up things that went down as a result of it. An eye for an eye. An attack on Japan for the attack on Pearl Harbor. After Imperial Japan pulled a fast one and bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American morale, understandably, took a bit of a hit, and as we've discussed in a previous video, soldier and civilian morale can quite literally decide the outcome of just about any war. To boost their country's morale after Pearl Harbor, the high-ups of the US started concocting a recipe for a revenge. While the wheels were somewhat in motion before he was onboarded, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a Top Gun level pilot and aeronautic wizard, took charge of the operation early in 1942, using his mad skills and know-how to prepare a dish the Japanese would never forget. The plan was to lay waste to Honshu, Japan with carrier-based American bombers, demonstrating to the Japanese that their home islands were not, in fact, safe on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, however, Doolittle had to overcome a plethora of logistical challenges. Firstly, to increase the range of attack, Doolittle needed to figure out where the bombers would land after they delivered their payloads. While a location inside the Soviet Union was considered, it ended up not working out because the USSR and Japan were bound to a neutrality pact at the time. Ultimately, Doolittle came to an agreement with the Chinese who would allow the bombers to touch down in China, refuel, and go on their way. Such a route meant that the bombers would have to fly some 4,400 kilometers or 2,750 miles, and all without fighter escorts. Doolittle's next task was to figure out which model of bomber would best suit the job, which included delivering a 910 kilogram or 2,000 pound bomb load. Ultimately, he settled on North American B-25B Mitchell medium bomber, of which he employed 16 in total. But as they were, the B-25s wouldn't have been able to make the journey, so Doolittle had to figure out what the planes needed and what they could go without. To detail just a few changes, the bombers were equipped with additional fuel tanks, which almost doubled their fuel capacity, while features such as the lower gun turret and liaison radio set were taken out. When the bombers were ready to roll, they were arranged on the deck of the American Yorktown-class aircraft carrier USS Hornet, taking up the space that fighter planes would usually occupy. As Hornet couldn't deploy fighters of its own, it met up with a naval task force comprised of the carrier USS Enterprise, 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers, shortly after it departed San Francisco early in April 1942. On board the USS Hornet were a total of 80 airmen who would physically conduct the raid, James Doolittle among them. He wasn't about to sit back and let his men do all the dirty work. Venturing into Japanese-controlled waters, everything went pretty smooth for the task force until the morning of the 18th of April when they were spotted by a Japanese patrol craft when they were still about 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles east of Japan, or about 310 kilometers or 200 miles short of where they had intended to let fly the B-25s. After the task force blew the patrol craft to hell, Doolittle decided he wouldn't risk it. He and his fellow airmen saddled up, then set off above the waves on their way to Japan, where sweet vengeance awaited them. About 6 hours later, they arrived over Honshu, where it was midday, and started dropping bombs on military personnel and civilian workers just trying to enjoy their lunch. In retaliation, the B-25s of course copped some flak from anti-aircraft guns and a handful of enemy fighters, but none of them went down. Not yet anyway. With their bomb bays empty, all but one of the 16 bombers steered for China. The odd crew out was super low on fuel and they steered toward the USSR instead, where they were arrested. As for the bulk of the bombers, after a 10-hour flight, they either crash-landed or bailed out somewhere over China, where fate had its way with their crew. Despite the sheer audacity of the Doolittle Raid, the bombers did stuff all damage to Honshu relatively. Around 50 Japanese people, military personnel and civilians included, were killed, while a further 400 were injured and the damage done to Japanese infrastructure was negligible. The true blow fell on Japanese morale, which plummeted when the Japanese people realized their home islands were not, in fact, beyond the reach of the American Hornets they'd pissed off when they kicked the nest back in December. Additionally, with the home islands revealed as vulnerable, the Japanese withdrew some of their forces from other operations to stand in defense of Japan proper. Japanese morale plummeted even further when the US task force that delivered and escorted the B-25s managed to evade the Japanese Second Fleet and make it back to safe waters entirely unscathed. On the other side of the coin, American morale skyrocketed. For many, the United States had landed a stiff jab, after which a knockout combo would surely follow. But what about their airmen, and what would Japan do now that their hornet's nest had been kicked? All in all, 69 of the 80 Doolittle Raid airmen, James Doolittle included, eventually made it back home or to the next flight, while the remaining 11 either perished or became prisoners of war. Of these 11 men, 2 drowned after their B-25s crashed into the ocean, while a third man lost his life trying to bail out over China. 8 crewmen were captured by the Japanese after they landed, with 3 of them getting executed and a 4th man dying in captivity. The remaining 4 POWs were eventually repatriated. Every man, dead or alive, was awarded the Purple Heart or Distinguished Flying Cross respectively, and every safe return only bolstered American morale. As for James Doolittle, he received the Medal of Honor and a sweet promotion. But in regards to a price paid for the Doolittle Raid, 11 casualties hardly compares to what the Chinese ended up paying simply for helping the Americans. While they had other motivations, a big part of what inspired the Japanese to carry out Operation Seigo or the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign was revenge for China's smallish role in the Doolittle Raid. From the 15th of May to the 4th of September 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army brought ruin to the people of Jiangxi, China, killing as many as 70,000 Chinese military personnel and 250,000 civilians, an estimated 10,000 when they were searching for the downed American airmen alone. If that wasn't bad enough, the Japanese Biological and Chemical Warfare Unit, Unit 731, participated in Operation Seigo, leaving a trail of disease in their wake. It was during this operation, of course, that those aforementioned 8 American POWs were captured. Reflecting on the Doolittle Raid in July 1942, James Doolittle himself said, "It was hoped that the damage done would be both material and psychological. The psychological results, it was hoped, would be the recalling of combat equipment from other theaters for home defense, thus affecting relief in those theaters, the development of a fear complex in Japan, and a favorable reaction on the American people. With those goals in mind, it might be said that the Doolittle Raid was a success. When you consider Operation Seigo, however, it might be a little harder to throw around a word like success." The Gurkhas, or Gurkhas, are Nepalese soldiers who serve in the armies of other nations in a similar manner to the French Foreign Legion, which we covered in a recent video. You've almost certainly heard of the Gurkhas and their vicious forward-curving knives before, but it's possible you're unfamiliar with the extent of their involvement in the Second World War. In this video, we're going to provide you with an overview of the theatres the infamous Gurkhas fought in and pepper in the stories of some Victoria Cross-winning Gurkhas as we go. During World War II, the Gurkhas served under the British Indian Army. This was a relationship rooted in history. During the Anglo-Nepalese War, waged between the British East India Company and the Gurkha Kingdom of Nepal from 1814 to 1816, the company took thousands of soldiers who had defected from the Gurkha army under its wing. It was during this time that the terms Gurkha and Gurkha unit were born. This trend of Gurkhas fighting for the company continued until the Indian Rebellion of 1857, after which the British Crown took the reins from the company and created the British Indian Army. Now the Gurkhas fought for the Crown in distinct units, cementing their reputation as fierce warriors in a number of conflicts, including the Great War. From 1914 to 1918, some 200,000 Gurkhas fought for the British in 33 Gurkha battalions, sustaining 20,000 casualties and earning around 2,000 military awards. It was only natural that the British Indian Army employed them in the Second World War as well. At their peak during the Second World War, 40 Gurkha battalions were mobilized, amounting to 250,000 kukri-wielding maniacs and their British officers. Around 8,900 were killed in action or went MIA, while a further 23,600 were wounded. Of note, Gurkha units served in North Africa, the Middle East, Italy, Greece, India, Malaya, Singapore, and of course, Borneo. While the Gurkhas' involvement in the 1948 to 1960 Malayan emergency might be more well known, they also served in Malaya during World War II, notably in the Battle of Jitra. Under the 11th Indian Division, the 2nd Battalions of the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Gurkha Rifles battled the Japanese 5th Infantry Division at the town of Jitra. The men of the 1st Gurkha Rifles positioned themselves north of Jitra at a village called Asun on the south bank of the stream. Lacking anti-tank guns, they set demolition charges on a bridge to blow it up and prevent the passage of the 5th Infantry Division's supporting tanks. In the rain, on the 11th of December 1941, the charges failed to go off. Thinking fast, a Gurkha by the name of Man Bahadur Gurung took up an anti-tank rifle and opened fire on 2 tanks as they reached the bridge, choking it up. Unfortunately, the Japanese made short work of the stream and captured much of the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Gurkha Rifles. Only around 200 of the 550 men in the unit made it out. The battle wasn't looking good for the 11th Indian Division. They withdrew under the Japanese onslaught, with the men of the 2nd and 9th Gurkha Rifles guarding their retreat. The men of the 2nd repulsed a Japanese advance on a different bridge at midnight on the 13th, then successfully blew the bridge up. The men of the 9th staved off another brutal Japanese assault in the early hours of the morning, allowing the survivors of the Indian Division to escape. The Battle of Imphal in Manipur, India was one of the 2 major battles which spelt the beginning of the end for the Japanese in the Burma campaign. Of the British 4th Corps' 49 battalions, 16 of them were composed of Gurkhas. The battle raged from March to July 1944, resulting in almost 55,000 Japanese wounded or killed, 12,600 Allies wounded or killed, and an Allied victory. Agan Singh Rai, an acting Naik or corporal of the 5th Gurkha Rifles, fought in this battle, claiming a VC for his actions at Mortar Bluff and Water Picket to the southwest of Imphal on the 26th of June. When his company was pinned down by a machine gun at Mortar Bluff, Agan Singh Rai charged the position under a hail of bullets, killing 3 of its 4 crew by himself. Coming under fire from a 37mm gun from the jungle, Agan Singh Rai charged again. All but 3 of the men in his section were killed, but Agan Singh Rai managed to take down a further 3 Japanese and capture the gun. Assaulting Water Picket shortly after, Agan Singh Rai wielded a Tommy gun in one hand and a grenade in the other. He rushed a Japanese bunker and ended 4 more lives. According to his VC citation, the enemy, demoralized by this NCO's calm display of courage and complete contempt for danger, now fled before the onslaught. Of all the places the Gurkhas fought, Burma is where they gained the most fame. Some 35,000 of them battled the Japanese there, accounting for 27 of their 40 battalions. Notably, many of these Gurkhas served in long-range penetration groups or Chindits. They operated deep behind enemy lines in the jungle, with the Gurkhas moving in columns of about 370 men. So far, we've only covered Nepalese VC winners, but as we said earlier, British officers often commanded Gurkha units. Among them was Captain Michael Almand, who commanded a platoon of the 6th Gurkha Rifles during Chindit operations in Burma. On the 11th of June 1944, Almand had been ordered to attack the Pinmi Road Bridge. The area surrounding the bridge was swampy and covered in jungle, and the Japanese had dug in on the banks of the road. As Almand approached, the Japanese opened fire, inflicting heavy casualties. While his men took cover, Almand charged, lobbing grenades at the Japanese machine gun positions and slaying 3 Japanese with his kukri knife. His men rallied and seized their objective. Over the next few days, taking charge of his company, Almand neutralized several more machine gun positions completely on his own. On the 23rd, while suffering from trench foot, Almand rushed 1 final Japanese machine gun nest and was gunned down. All in all, about 1/3 of the VCs awarded in Burma went to Gurkhas. As Indian Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw put it, if a man says he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he's a Gurkha. The whole point of covert operations is that, well, they're covert. Unfortunately, this means that covert Special Forces operatives tend to miss out on the gratitude they might deserve. While the Second World War may have come to an end in 1945, the veterans of one particular Allied Special Forces unit swore never to speak of their heroic yet horrible exploits, bottling up their suffering till the waning years of their lives. These men were the bane of the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and they weren't opposed to working with literal headhunters to see their common enemy dead on the jungle floor. In this video, we shine some much needed light in the Australian-led special force known as Z Special Unit. It's no secret that many of the world's special operations organisations have modelled themselves after British Spec Ops, as was the case with the Australian Inter-Allied Services Department, or ISD, which, in typical Spec Ops fashion, underwent a series of administrative and acronymic changes to become the Services Reconnaissance Department, or SRD, in 1943. While it was still the ISD, a field unit was formed under its command, designed to carry out intelligence, special reconnaissance and sabotage operations, as well as guerrilla warfare against Imperial Japan in the Southwest Pacific. This was Z Special Unit. While primarily a Vegemite-fueled Australian force, Z Special Unit featured volunteers from New Zealand, Britain, the Netherlands, and, while abroad, Indonesia too. Most of their pre-deployment training, however, took place in Australia, most notably in Refuge Bay, Sydney, Z Experimental Station, Queensland, and Fraser Island, Queensland, yet also in Western Australia and the Northern Territory. And one of their trademark tools wasn't a gun, but a folding kayak, inside which many Z operatives would come to break their backs. While Z Special Unit took on 264 missions in 81 covert operations between June 1942 and the end of the war, its operations in Queensland, Singapore, New Guinea, and Borneo are among its most famous, or more appropriately, infamous. Yes, you heard that right. Z Special Unit did indeed operate in Queensland, Australia, but they obviously didn't go around blowing up bridges or anything like that. In reality, in preparation for a raid on a Japanese-occupied port in New Guinea, Z Special Unit decided it would be a good idea to practice on Australian naval vessels in Townsville Harbour. In the dead of night on the 22nd of June 1943, they paddled into the harbour on folding kayaks and stuck magnetic limpet mines to the hulls of 10 ships before fleeing. Some hours after the rooster crowed the following morning, the sailors in the harbour freaked out over the, unbeknownst to them, dummy mines. The mock operation was a success, but it led to the arrest and subsequent discharge of Lieutenant Samuel Warren Carey from Z Special Unit. The operation into New Guinea was also trashed, but for unrelated reasons. What the Z operations learned in Townsville, they put to good use in Singapore later that year. By 1943, the Japanese had a firm grip on Singapore, an island stronghold vital to Allied operations in the Pacific. While they held onto the island until the end of the war, the Allies didn't make it easy for them. On the 2nd of September, 15 Australian and British Z operatives left Western Australia in the MV Crate, a Japanese fishing boat renamed after a small but highly venomous snake. They dyed their hair and skin dark and dressed themselves in sarongs, meaning to pass as Indonesian fishermen, and arrived off Singapore just over 3 weeks later. Unfolding their kayaks, they paddled to a nearby island from which they set Singapore Harbour in their sights. On the night of the 26th, they pulled another Townsville, yet this time with very real limpet mines. The resulting blasts damaged or sunk 4 Japanese ships. As Z veteran Douglas Herbst put it, they travelled thousands of miles in enemy-occupied territory, then got out of the boat and paddled canoes for 100 miles into Singapore. The Crate was a little 70-foot boat and it sank more shipping than cruisers with 800 men on board. But the success of the Crate and her sneaky crew was not an indication of successes to come. A year later, Z operatives tried a similar stunt, this time using a Malayan sailing ship to get them closer and motorized submersible canoes nicknamed Sleeping Beauties to deliver their payloads. Nearing Singapore Harbour, a Japanese patrol boat stopped them, detecting their ploy and opening fire. The operatives scuttled their ship and escaped on kayaks. While some were able to put some distance between them and their attackers and ultimately resume their mission, potentially sinking 3 Japanese ships in Singapore Harbour, 13 Z Special Unit operatives were killed immediately or lost their lives soon after. A further 10 were captured and beheaded. And this wasn't like in Skyrim or whatever. Some of these beheadings took 2 or 3 blows to complete. Disaster struck in New Guinea in 1945 as well, yet the Z operatives assigned to this mission showed their mettle no less. Under the veil of night on the 11th of April, 8 Z operatives disembarked a patrol boat and started the long paddle to the shore of Japanese-occupied Muschu Island. The currents were strong that night, however, and the operatives ran into a reef, losing some of their equipment to the waves. While they were unable to get their feet on solid ground, their gear had washed up on the shore, signaling their presence to the Japanese, who sent out 1,000 troops to hunt them down. Despite their training, there was little the Z operatives could do. All but one of them were slain, but one man did survive. Fighting off the Japanese all by himself, one sapper, Edgar Mick Dennis, a hardened Australian commando, managed to escape and get vital intel into Allied hands, contributing in no small part to the Allies' success in the Aitape-Wewak campaign. Dennis survived the war as well, going on to say, "They were hunting me, and every time they got close, I would knock the first few over and then go bush." And on his bravery, he said, "I don't think it's born in you, it's not drilled into you, it's just something that happens in the spur of the moment. You know what you're going to do and you do it." While Singapore and New Guinea were terrible, Z's special unit operations in Borneo were a complete nightmare, even the successful ones. Between 1943 and 1945, Z operatives harried the Japanese troops who were occupying Borneo and inflicting unspeakable suffering on the island's people. As all good special forces should do, Z's special unit made effective use of their environment, going as far to train and organize the indigenous natives to help them defeat their common enemy. One of such operations was Operation Argas, in which 44 Z Special Unit operatives gathered vital intel and trained indigenous natives for a guerrilla campaign against their Japanese occupiers between March and October 1945. The intel they obtained clued the Australian 9th Division into Japanese numbers and movements in North Borneo, ultimately allowing them to take and secure it. The local guerrillas also managed to slay around 100 Japanese troops. Among the Z operatives in Borneo was Aussie Jack Tredrea, known by his fellow operatives as Commando Jack. On his time in Borneo, where he was assigned to Operation Samut, Jack said, "We did our jump into Borneo 4 months before the invasion to organize the native population. We trained 2,000 of them, and when the invasion came, we had 32 operatives, each with their own guerrilla force." While Tredrea was quite active in the media in the waning years of his life, the story of Australian Sergeant Fred Sanderson isn't so widely known. After parachuting into Borneo in March 1945, he led some 500 headhunting natives against the Japanese, earning himself a Distinguished Conduct Medal and the headhunters under his charge more than 100 enemy heads. On his experience, Sanderson said, "I was always thinking what it was going to be like when I was hunted. I always thought the Japanese would get me one day." But all of these heroic exploits were swept under the rug, coming to light only decades after the end of the war. As Commando Jack put it, "When we were discharged out of Z's Special Unit, the operatives had to sign a Secrets Act. It wasn't until 1980 at a national reunion in Melbourne that we knew what the next guy did." In this video, we're going to discuss the Chinese Expeditionary Force, primarily its constituent X and Y forces in greater detail, as the Burma campaign in particular might have gone very differently without the Chinese. Before we get to X force and Y force, it's worth understanding China's position in the war. To put it simply, it wasn't so good. Since 1927, the Nationalist Party of China-led Republic of China had been at war with the Communist Party of China, and this bloody conflict was merely put on hold when, in 1937, a full-blown war broke out between China and Japan. A little over 2 years later, after hundreds of thousands of Chinese had already been killed, the rest of the world fell into chaos following Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland. Despite being preoccupied with the ongoing Second Sino-Japanese War inside of China, the Nationalist Republic of China wasn't too keen to get put on the spit by the Japanese banzai charging through Burma toward China's southern underbelly. Nor was the Republic eager to forfeit the Burma Road, via which it had been receiving vital supplies from the United States for some time. So the Chinese teamed up with the British, who had been, in classic British style, ruling Burma since 1824. The Chinese units sent to contest the Japanese were collectively known as the Chinese Expeditionary Force. As part of China and Britain's forced bromance, the Chinese Expeditionary Force, comprised of the 5th, 6th, and 66th Army, fell under the command of American General Joseph Stilwell on the ground and Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek back in China. As you can imagine, not every Chinese soldier was too chuffed about taking orders from a non-Chinese general, and tensions between Stilwell and Chiang only grew as the Japanese bent the Allies over at Rangun and chased them northwards, gutting Burma up the middle. The Allies weren't entirely on their back foot, however. While the Chinese Expeditionary Force weren't able to maintain a front in the heart of Burma, as Allied command had wanted, the Chinese gave the Japanese a seriously hard time in a few battles of note. In the Battle of Taungoo, from the 19th to the 29th of March 1942, the 200th Division of Chiang's 5th Army, which had taken over the defense of the city of Taungoo from the British, held with tooth and nail against an all-out Japanese attack for 10 days before withdrawing, sustaining heavy casualties but also inflicting them in turn. We already covered the Battle of Yananjuang in our aforementioned video, so for those of you who haven't seen that, the general gist of it is as follows. While defending Yananjuang oil fields from the Japanese, some 7,000 soldiers of the British Burma Corps were encircled by many Japanese troops, and when things were looking grim, over 1,100 troops of the Chinese 38th Division penetrated the Japanese encirclement, slaying 700 Japanese troops and winning the battle. Of course, this victory didn't amount to all that much in the grand scheme of the Burma campaign, and the Allies were given little choice but to try and flee the country. Doing so in an orderly fashion, however, was easier said than done. Focusing on the Chinese Expeditionary Force, some Chinese troops went left, on Stilwell's orders, into India, while some went right, under Chinese General Du Yuming, into the Chinese province of Yunnan. While both groups had it rough, the troops who followed Du Yuming to China were pulped in Japanese ambushes and turned inside out by disease. All in all, some 23,000 Chinese troops made it to India behind Stilwell. It's safe to say that the Allies were feeling pretty sorry for themselves after this disastrous defeat, but they were by no means out of the running. From the remnants of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, two major Chinese forces were fashioned. From the troops who fled to India, there was X-Force, which grew to a strength of 5 divisions and some 75,000 troops. And from the troops who fled to Yunnan, China, there was Y-Force, which grew to a strength of 25 divisions and some 175,000 troops. Under Stilwell, some 2,000 American support troops and advisors fell in with X-Force, and the force benefited from American training and equipment. In the words of American General Sir William Slim, commander of the Burma Corps, the most important thing of all was to ensure that the American-trained Chinese not only fought, but fought successfully. No one could do that as well as Stilwell himself. Indeed, he was the only American who had authority to actually command the Chinese. Conversely, Japanese General Tanaka Shinichi stated that the post-Japanese invasion Chinese were far superior in both the quality of their fighting and their equipment. Despite Stilwell's insistence to take charge of the force, Y-Force remained under Chinese command while also enjoying the benefits of American advisors. All in all, it was by far the larger of the two forces, yet not as well prepared as its India-based counterpart. Coordinating with Y-Force, which operated out of China, Slim's Burma Corps, which operated out of India, and various allied special operations units such as Merrill's Marauders, the Chindits, and the local guerrilla force, the Kachin Raiders, Stilwell prepared to take the fight back to the Japanese in North Burma. X-Force and Slim's Burma Corps would open up a front from the north and southwest. Y-Force, despite Chiang's reluctance, would open up a front from the east, and the Spec Ops forces would simply run amok in the jungle. Aiming X-Force toward the town of Mogang and the city of Myitkyina, Stilwell intended, in his own words, to go through a rat hole and dig the hole as we go. As it would turn out, capturing Myitkyina on the 3rd of August 1944 was arguably the most crucial victory in the Allied offensive of North Burma, and the American general owed it all to the brave Chinese troops with whom the Republic of China had trusted him. To quote Slim again, he went on to write, "The capture of Myitkyina, so long delayed, marked the complete success of the first stage of Stilwell's campaign. When all was said and done, the success of the northern offensive was in the main owing to the Chinese divisions of X-Force, and that was Stilwell. It was the largest seizure of enemy-held territory that had yet occurred. Throughout the rest of 1944 up until September 1945, the Allied forces launched a series of offensives into Burma, working their way south and ultimately retaking Rangun. Chiang, however, ordered the Chinese troops of X-Force to advance no further than the town of Lashio, which was captured on the 7th of March. And by April, the Chinese troops of both X-Force and Y-Force were booking it out of Burma, with all Chinese units having withdrawn to China by the 1st of July. Allied command wasn't too happy about this, but with the Japanese wreaking havoc in China and a civil war looming just behind the curtain, could they really blame him? Unfortunately for the soldiers of X and Y Force in the world, they were mostly eradicated by the Communist Party of China's People's Liberation Army when the Chinese Civil War resumed. Their combat experience in Burma counting for little at the end of the day. There are many contenders for the coveted title of most effective elite force in World War II, but every unit, from the Japanese 343rd Naval Air Group to the British Commandos, suffered combat losses, except one. This elite American force completed over 100 missions deep behind enemy lines and played a vital role in the liberation of the Pacific. This is the story of the Alamo Scouts. The Alamo Scouts was the brainchild of the US 6th Army's commander, Lieutenant General Kruger. Having risen from the ranks and fought on the front lines of 3 previous wars, Kruger recognized the value of good intel. But as his 6th Army advanced through the Pacific, good intel was in short supply. Seemingly from nowhere, massive numbers of Japanese troops appeared in his path, and he was forced to fight through them. These Japanese defenders were often cut off from their main supply bases closer to Japan. With careful avoidance, they could be starved out. This was a far better solution for the Americans than engaging them in battle. By bypassing Japanese troop concentrations, thousands of Allied soldiers could be saved. But to do that, Kruger needed good intel, and he wasn't getting it from his staff. He needed an elite unit of scouts that could operate behind enemy lines as his eyes and ears. So in November 1943, he founded the Alamo Scouts. 700 candidates from the 6th Army were selected for scout training, which lasted 6 weeks. Candidates were selected for their jungle warfare skills, keen perception, and physical stamina. All had previous combat experience, and all were volunteers. If you didn't want to be an Alamo Scout, you could leave and return to your old unit at any time. The training was grueling and few made it through. In one exercise, candidates were blindfolded and made to navigate through the jungle without being seen or caught. Using sound, smell, and touch, they had to remain camouflaged and navigate to a specific area. If they were spotted by the instructors, snipers fired live rounds into the trees and the ground around them. This was meant to motivate the candidates to do better. The training course was likely the most intense of the war and included, amongst other exercises, knife fighting, enemy weapons training, a 10-page written exam, treatment of infected cuts, gunshot wounds and malaria, aircraft recognition, actual patrols into enemy territory, rudimentary Tok Pisin, Malay, Tagalog and Japanese language, combat judo and guerrilla tactics. At the end, the candidates were given a chance to report on each other. This assessed whether they were actually team players, a test still commonly used in special forces training today. Of the 700 initial candidates, 321 passed the 6-week course to become full Alamo Scouts. Of these, only the best 138 were retained, while the rest were sent back to their units to organize scout units of their own. But their real test was yet to come. Once qualified, individual Alamo Scouts were organized into 6 to 7 man teams. Each team member was a demolitions expert, sniper, radio operator, and point man in his own right, so decisions were often made democratically, a system still common in today's special forces. Their first mission was a recon job in the Admiralty Islands, located in the north of the Bismarck Archipelago. Aerial imagery suggested the islands had been abandoned by the Japanese, and General MacArthur wanted Kruger to deploy 800 men of the 1st Cavalry Division to occupy them. But Kruger had his doubts. He didn't believe the islands were abandoned, so he sent in the Alamo Scouts to make sure. As it turned out, he was right. At 0645 on February 27, 1944, a Catalina flying boat carrying Lieutenant McGowan's Alamo Scout team landed just off the southeastern tip of Los Negros Island. While the propellers were still turning, the Scouts launched a rubber boat from the Catalina and paddled to shore. After concealing the boat, they disappeared into the jungle. McGowan's scout team stealthily moved inland, following subtle tracks left by enemy soldiers. They discovered 3 camouflage machine gun positions connected by a trench line and could hear Japanese soldiers manning the position. Kruger was right, the island was still occupied. If the 1st Cavalry had landed as planned, they would have been massacred. The Scouts pulled back from their observation point but were almost detected by a Japanese platoon. Saved by their perfect camouflage, the men lay on the jungle floor while 15 Japanese soldiers wandered by just 3 meters away. They never noticed the Scouts, but the Scouts noticed them. Namely, their insignia marking them out as Japanese Marines. They also carried spades and picks along with their rifles, indicating their intention to dig in. McGowan noted their uniforms were clean and well maintained too, illustrating their high morale. Once the Marines had disappeared, the Scouts set up camp in a little used part of the jungle. They radioed what they'd seen back to base and were picked up by Catalina the following night. McGowan's report was rushed to Kruger and the other generals, who called off the landing and organized a massive naval and aerial bombardment of the island. The 1st Cavalry made their landing later and suffered only light casualties. By the end of their first mission, the Alamo Scouts had proven invaluable, but their greatest feat was yet to come. In June 1944, Filipino guerrillas supported by the Allies reported that roughly 500 POWs were being held in a Japanese prison camp near the village of Cabanatuan on the island of Luzon. This information wasn't acted on until January 1945, when Kruger's intelligence officers devised a rescue plan. The spooks had received words that retreating Japanese forces were liquidating POW camps before abandoning their positions. Contravening both the Geneva Accords and basic humanity, the Japanese were killing off POWs to stop them from falling into friendly hands. They were also aware that any POWs left alive could testify against their captors once the war was over. The POWs had needed rescuing, and the Alamo Scouts were gonna make it happen. On the night of January 29th, 2 Alamo Scout teams met up with members of Captain Pahota's and Captain Hossen's guerrilla companies. These men knew the region better than anyone and were willing to guide the Scouts in. The guerrillas got the Scouts close to the camp, but there wasn't enough cover to set up an observation post. Lieutenant Nellist, the Scout leader, dressed up as a local farmer with Filipino-American Scout Private Vakala. In full view of the Japanese guards, they walked to a hut 300 meters from the camp fence. From there, the men spent 8 hours observing the camp and calculating its defenses. The Filipino guerrillas made contact with locals who had been forced to work in the camp and collected additional information for the Scouts. Once compiled into a report, the guerrillas transported a copy back to headquarters, where Lieutenant Colonel Mucci's Ranger Battalion was waiting. If the Alamo Scouts were the scalpel of this operation, the Rangers were the sledgehammer. That evening, with support from the guerrillas, they attacked. They left their base at 1700, arriving outside the camp in complete darkness. At around 1900, a series of loud explosions tore through the quiet night. A P-61 Black Widow from the 547th Night Fighter Squadron overflew the camp at low altitude, periodically cutting and restarting one of its engines. The resulting backfires drew the attention of all the camp guards, who assumed the plane had been damaged and was hurtling toward the ground. The pilots, Captain Schreiber and First Lieutenant Rux, completed their act by flying over the nearby hills less than 10 meters above the ground. As the distracted Japanese defenders waited for the inevitable explosion, guerrillas cut the telephone cables and the Rangers got into position. At 1940, they attacked. Small arms fire from the Rangers tore into every machine gun nest, guard tower and pillbox at the same time. With intelligence from the Scouts, the Rangers engaged every part of the Japanese defense simultaneously. The result was devastating. Within 15 seconds, every pillbox and tower had been destroyed. While the Rangers focused on the killing of the Japanese, the Alamo Scouts guided the POWs to safety. Many were too sick to walk, and the Scouts had to carry them out, but these men were so emaciated that a Scout could carry 2 at a time. Private First Class Kittleson, an Alamo Scout responsible for getting the POWs to safety, later said, "I didn't fire around there. I didn't have to. My job was to get those prisoners to the river, so I did that. Sometimes you had to almost grab a hold of them to keep them going the right direction, but they got there." By the end of the attack, the Rangers, guerrillas, and Alamo Scouts had liberated 552 POWs from the camp at Cabanatuan. The Alamo Scouts suffered no losses. In fact, they never suffered a combat loss throughout all of their 106 known operations behind enemy lines. So that was the badass story of the Alamo Scouts, one of the most successful elite forces of the Second World War. When it comes to the most hellish campaigns of the Second World War, the New Guinea campaign is up there as a top contender. If the enemy didn't kill you, insects and disease would, and it's likely that a lot of soldiers would have welcomed a bullet at certain points during those 3.5 years of anguish. With that said, the New Guinea campaign tends to go a little under the radar. In this video, we hope to rectify that. The New Guinea campaign took place throughout the Australian-administered territory of New Guinea, the Australian-administered territory of Papua, which together now make up Papua New Guinea, and Netherlands New Guinea from January 1942 to August 1945. It was primarily fought between the Aussies and the Japanese, with Australia supported by the US, the UK, and the Netherlands. The Japanese capture of the city on Rabaul on New Britain Island, part of New Guinea, in January and February, kicked the whole thing off. Here, some 5,000 Japanese troops overwhelmed the Aussies, killing or capturing around 1,130 of the 1,500 odd troops they had positioned on New Britain and, next to it, New Ireland as prisoners of war. With the foothold in Rabaul, the Japanese 8th Area Army set its sights on its principal goal in the New Guinea campaign, the city of Port Moresby on Papua's southern shore. To achieve this, their next step was to invade the mainland at Lae and Salamua in New Guinea, which they did, almost unopposed, on the 8th of March 1942. Rather than trying to stave off the Japanese massing there, the American General Douglas MacArthur concentrated the participating Allied forces in Port Moresby under the military command designated New Guinea Force. Under the command of General Hatazao Adachi, who was responsible for Imperial Japan's forces in mainland New Guinea, the Japanese intended to make a bit of a Port Moresby sandwich. From the village of Buna, situated to the southeast of Salamau and Papua, they planned to advance on Port Moresby over the Owen Stanley Mountains using the infamous Kokoda Track, while the other half of the sandwich would come in the form of a naval infantry troop invasion via Milne Bay on Papua's eastern tip. But as we're sure some of you know, hiking the Kokoda Track is easier said than done, and the Japanese totally underestimated the Aussies at Milne Bay. The Kokoda Track campaign was hell, and it was typical of the horrors of its parent campaign. For much of the Kokoda campaign, the Japanese had the Aussies on their back feet, pushing them almost to Port Moresby until, in September 1942, having outrun their supply lines, they were forced to withdraw. For all that time, the Aussies' lines had been stretched out and they had been fighting a brutal jungle war they weren't trained for. Now, close to Port Moresby, their supply lines were shorter and their artillery was in range. They toiled back through the jungle-thick mountains and brought the fight to Buna and nearby Gona, which they seized from the Japanese by the 16th of November. For the entire campaign, both the Allies and Japanese troops suffered immeasurably. As written in American war historian Samuel Milner's Victory in Papua, the men stumbled over vines and roots with every step as they made their way through the muck and slime. The ever-present mud was sometimes so deep that men sank into it up to their knees. Immense ridges, or razorbacks, followed each other in succession like the teeth of a saw. The only way groups could get up them was on hands and knees, or by cutting steps into them with an axe and machete. The troops were constantly at the mercy of mites, mosquitoes, and leeches. Acute diarrhea and dysentery gripped most of the battalion. Many men owed their lives to the doctors who picked them up and cared for them when they were so sick and weak that they were ready to call it quits and die. If that didn't paint the picture well enough, one sergeant, Paul R. Lutjens, wrote this in his diary. "Boys are falling out and dropping back with fever. Continual downpour. We seem to climb straight up for hours, then down again. God, will it ever end?" While this was going on, the Japanese waged a war from the sky on Port Moresby. The first air raid took place on the 3rd of February 1942. At the start, Port Moresby's only air defences were anti-aircraft batteries and machine guns. The situation was especially desperate, but the Kitty Hawks of the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 75 Squadron were on their way. As per the diary of one George Henry Johnston, first daylight raid on Moresby. 9 naval bombers very high, 18,000 to 22,000 feet. With no fighters here, it seems likely that we shall see plenty of daylight raids from now on. When are the promised Kitty Hawks coming? Everyone refers to them now as Tomorrow Hawks. 75 Squadron arrived on the 21st of March, and the American 8th Bombardment Squadron rocked up shortly after. On the 30th of April, the US 35th and 36th Pursuit Squadrons came to lend a helping hand. By then, 75 Squadron had been reduced to just 3 serviceable planes. What remained of the squadron left New Guinea shortly after and returned in late July to fly alongside No. 76 Squadron out of Milne Bay. As for Port Moresby, the Americans stayed to defend it, and on the 23rd of January 1943, the Japanese carried out their 100th raid on the port. They would continue raiding it until August 1943. Their last major daylight raid on Port Moresby took place on the 12th of April 1943 as part of the Japanese Operation Igo. As for Milne Bay, the Japanese underestimated the Aussies in that battle and paid the price for it. 75 Squadron was all patched up after Port Moresby and ready to fight alongside 76, and the Aussies had between 7,500 and 8,800 soldiers on the ground, in contrast to the 1,940 troops and 2, yes, just 2, tanks of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force. The Japanese hit the beach on the 25th of August 1942 and drove the Aussies back through the jungle for about a week, but 75 and 76 squadrons were tearing them up the whole time, and by the morning of the 1st of September, the Japanese were giving it legs back to the beach, their tanks abandoned to the mud. By the 7th, the Aussies had inflicted over 900 casualties, with kills accounting for about 2/3 of that figure, and had achieved one of the most decisive victories against Imperial Japan in the entire war. It was also one of the war's most brutal battles, with war crimes committed by both sides. According to Australian Sergeant Arthur Trail, we would shoot at the slightest sign of life and stab with bayonet even the ones who appeared to be rotten. It was all out from then on, neither side showing any quarter and no prisoners were taken. After getting smashed on the Kokoda track, the subsequent Battle of Bunagona, and in the Battle of Milne Bay, you might think the Japanese would just give up on Port Moresby, but that was the exact opposite of what they did. In late January, they decided to give an overland advance another crack, this time via the Aussie-held village of Wau, which is closer to Lae and Salamua than Kokoda. It did not go well. The Aussies bombed the Japanese as they shipped reinforcements to Lae, taking 1,100 troops out of the equation when they sank the transport ship Nichiryo Maru alone. Still, the Japanese were able to land some 4,000 troops. Conversely, the Aussies reinforced Wau from the sky. Between the 29th of January and the 1st of February, hundreds of Allied aircraft made hundreds of trips to the village, raising their defending force to a strength of some 3,000 men. Just like in Milne Bay, the Japanese seriously underestimated the Aussies, who managed to kill a further 750 Japanese and drive the remaining 2,700 back to the coast, where they got back on their ships and fled to Rabaul, utterly ashamed of themselves. At this point, the Aussies had defeated the Japanese in numerous battles and gained a ton of experience. It was time to bring the fight to the Japanese and cast them out of New Guinea, Papua, and Netherlands New Guinea. But that's a whole nother can of worms. So we'll be covering the later stages of the New Guinea campaign, namely Operation Cartwheel and the Western New Guinea campaign, in a follow-up video, which we'll be releasing very soon. As we said in our previous video on the New Guinea campaign, it tends to go a little under the radar. This is especially true for the second half of the campaign, in which the Allies were no longer on the defensive and were ready to launch an offensive of their own. An offensive that would erode the Japanese 8th Area Army's foothold on New Guinea, Papua, and Dutch New Guinea. We can break the Allied offensive into two parts. Operation Cartwheel, which went from June 1943 to March 1944, and the Western New Guinea Campaign, which went from April 1944 to August 1945. While the Australians spearheaded the first half of the New Guinea campaign, the US played a far more significant role in the second half, especially in Dutch or Western New Guinea. The principal objective of Operation Cartwheel was originally the capture of the major Japanese base at Rabaul on the island of New Britain, New Guinea. Directed by American General Douglas MacArthur, this would be achieved through 11 sub-operations and in concert with the nearby Solomon Islands campaign. In August 1943, however, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff met with the US President and Winston Churchill in Quebec and decided that the neutralization, instead of the capture of Rabaul, was a better plan. In short, the Allies would bomb Rabaul and seize the lands and islands to close it, but not actually invade Rabaul. About 4 months after the start of Operation Cartwheel, the US 5th Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, and Royal New Zealand Air Force started laying waste to Rabaul from the sky, taking off from the island of Bougainville and from naval air carriers. They continued laying waste to Rabaul through Operation Cartwheel, chipping away at Japanese resolve and material bit by bit. But the bombings were just one element of Cartwheel, and a whole lot of land-based fighting still went down. We're not going to delve into every sub-operation, but we'll cover a few. Operation Chronicle is important because it was the first. Beginning on the 23rd of June 1943, the Americans and Australians invaded the islands of Woodlark and Kirawana almost unopposed. The Japanese conducted a few minor defensive air raids, wounding several men, but scoring no kills. On the 30th of June, the Allies initiated Operation Toenails, yuck, or the New Georgia Campaign. A largely American force of approximately 43,000 men waged war against some 10,000 Japanese on the New Georgia Islands of the Solomons. Munda Point on the island's west coast was a hotspot. The US 43rd Division fought tooth and nail to seize the Japanese airfield at Munda, and the Japanese responded in kind. In the advance on Munda Point alone, the 43rd suffered 90 men killed, 636 wounded, and a further 1,000 evacuated due to illness, mostly combat stress reaction or combat fatigue. In the subsequent Battle of Munda Point, after the 25th and 37th Divisions reinforced the 43rd to amass a force of some 30,000 men, the Japanese brought the American casualty count up to 5,000 in exchange for a little under 4,700 Japanese soldiers killed. American war historian Samuel Eliot Morrison described what it was like on the ground. The Japanese attacked with blood-curdling streams, crawled silently into American foxholes, and stabbed or strangled them. Often, they cursed loudly in English, named the American commanding officers, and dared the Americans to fight. For sick and hungry soldiers who had fought all day, this was terrifying. The Americans shot at everything in sight, even comrades. The Americans did take Munda Point though, and by the 7th of October, all of New Georgia. This was a crucial step toward another important Operation Cartwheel sub-op, codenamed Cherry Blossom. The goal of Cherry Blossom was to take the major island northwest of New Georgia, Bougainville. This was a massive campaign incorporating some 174,000 Allied troops and between 45,000 and 65,000 Japanese troops, and lasting beyond the end of Cartwheel. From November 1943 to November 1944, the Americans landed on the Bougainville coast at the village of Torokina and toiled for a beachhead. From then until August 1945, the Australians sought out and destroyed the Japanese soldiers that remained on the island. Some 26,400 Japanese succumbed to tropical diseases and malnutrition throughout the campaign, and in the end, the Aussies were able to capture between 21,000 and 23,500 of the survivors. As we mentioned before, Bougainville's airfields were essential to the sustained Allied bombing of Rabaul. On the 15th of December 1943, the so-called Director Task Force, centered around the US 112th Cavalry Regiment, landed on the beaches in the swampy Araware area of New Britain. This was on the other side of the island to Rabaul. On the 26th, the US 1st Marine Division also hit New Britain at the northwest headland named Cape Gloucester. These landings, and the battles that followed, fell under the umbrella operation codenamed Dexterity. While the strategic value of the Arroway landing remains a topic of debate, it diverted about 1,000 Japanese soldiers from Cape Gloucester. In the end, the Allies managed to kill around 4,500 Japanese troops and chase the survivors out of western New Britain to Rabaul. Finally, the Allied landing on Emerald is important because it was the last of Cartwheel's 11 sub-operations. Like the very first sub-op, Operation Chronicle, Emerald was a breeze. 4,000 US Marines landed on the island, which sits in the sea to the north of New Britain, on the 20th of March 1944. They faced no opposition. The Japanese brought aerial reinforcements from Rabaul from the northward island of Truk in January 1944, but that ultimately just cost them more material. On the 19th of February 1944, between 70 and 120 Japanese planes withdrew from Rabaul. The Allied air raids continued, and Operation Cartwheel saw the Japanese forces at Rabaul isolated and, as intended, neutralized. They couldn't make offensives and couldn't be reinforced. Rabaul was pretty much a POW camp at this point. So that's New Guinea, Papua, and some of the Solomons covered, but what about Dutch New Guinea or Western New Guinea? Like Cartwheel, this campaign was made up of lots of sub-operations. Some took place in Dutch New Guinea, some in Australian New Guinea, and some on the surrounding islands, including as far off as Morotai. The campaign kicked off with two simultaneous operations, Persecution and Reckless. In Persecution, a largely American force made an amphibious landing at Aitape, New Guinea, on the 22nd of April 1944. They brought some 22,500 men to bear, vastly outnumbering the 1,000-odd Japanese combat troops in the area. By the 4th of May, half of the Japanese defenders were dead. The purpose of the operation was to cut the Japanese 18th Army, positioned to the east of Wawak, off from Hollandia, which was the east of Aitape in Dutch New Guinea. Hollandia was the objective of the concurrent Operation Reckless. In this operation, the US 24th and 41st Infantry Divisions made landings at Tanamura Bay and Humboldt Bay, forcing the Japanese 2nd Army to withdraw westward along the coast. Only 1,000 of the 7,200 Japanese who survived the initial attack and tried to retreat survived. The Americans mopped them up until the 6th of July 1944. On the 10th of July 1944, the Japanese 18th Army launched a counter-offensive to take Aitape back. It started with a bombardment and then a 10,000-man strong Japanese attack across the nearby Drignumor River. The US 11th Corps made a fighting withdrawal through the jungle, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese. This continued over the next couple weeks and involved savage close-ranged and even hand-to-hand combat. On the 29th, the 11th Corps launched a counter-offensive and pushed the Japanese back over the river. By the 4th of August, the Japanese were ordered to withdraw back from Wawak, having lost between 8,000 to 10,000 of the troops they ultimately committed to the counteroffensive. Many of these casualties were attributed to disease and starvation. A few months later, the Australian 6th Division arrived at Aitape to tag in for the Americans. The Australians were fresh and ready to rumble, while the Japanese had suffered defeat after defeat and lacked food, medicine, and air and naval support. From November 1944 to August 1945, some 13,000 Australian troops worked their way to Wawak, essentially mopping up the 30 to 35,000 Japanese troops in the area. Between 7,000 and 9,000 Japanese troops fell to Australian fire, while 13,000 surrendered. Disease and starvation did most of the work though, claiming a further 14,000 lives. Wawak fell on the 11th of May, and the surviving Japanese withdrew into the mountains. By August, the Aussies ceased their pursuit because they knew Imperial Japan would soon surrender. The Aitape Wawak campaign marked the end of the Western New Guinea campaign. With Rabaul neutralized, the Japanese forces in Dutch New Guinea crushed, and the Japanese home islands nuked, the New Guinea campaign was over. And while some deem it arguably the most arduous campaign fought by any Allied troops during World War II, the campaign still tends to go under the radar. We can only hope that we were able to shed some light on this bloody pocket of the war. After the Japanese bombed the Americans at Pearl Harbor, they began their invasion of the Philippines, a major step in their mission to control Southeast Asia. The Philippines were defended by some 150,000 American and Filipino troops, and while the Battle of the Philippines would see the vast majority of those men killed, wounded, or captured, the defending forces didn't go out without a fight, making a tremendous last stand on the Bataan Peninsula. Under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur, most of the 120,000 odd Allied troops on the Philippine island of Luzon worked their way to the peninsula while fighting off of their back foot and inflicting significant casualties on the Japanese. This occurred over a period of 3 months, during which time some 75,000 Japanese troops were either killed or well and truly tied up in the fighting and thus unable to contribute to operations elsewhere. In the words of MacArthur's intelligence officer, for instance, because of Bataan, the Japanese never managed to detach enough men, planes, ships, and material to nail down Guadalcanal. What many Allied soldiers in Bataan may have ended up regretting, however, was surrendering to the Japanese forces on the 9th of April 1942. Of the 76,000 Americans and Filipinos left alive enough to raise the white flag, the Japanese forced the vast majority into the infamous Bataan Death March, with only about 10,000 to 12,000 managing to escape the march and take the fight back to their brutal captors via guerrilla operations. On the other side of the coin, the Japanese mounted an uncompromising defense on the island of Iwo Jima against the Americans between the 19th of February and the 26th of March 1945. While the strategic significance of the invasion remains a topic of debate, the United States wanted to take Iwo Jima so they could use it as a stepping stone airbase between their forces in the Mariana Island and the Japanese home islands. To achieve this, they sent in some 110,000 military personnel, with Marine units comprising the majority of the invasion force and with over 500 warships providing naval support. The defenders numbered just 21,000 at most, but they were under the command of Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who knew he couldn't win the battle but wanted to cripple the Americans nonetheless. They dug in deep, setting up tunnel networks and camouflaged artillery positions among a range of other defenses to slow the American offensive to a grinding halt and do as much damage to them as humanly possible. When the Marines landed, they were torn apart by Japanese shells and snipers, and then forced to clamber uphill through volcanic sand to face a fanatical enemy head-on. In classic Imperial Japanese style, the defenders refused to surrender, opting instead to hold out in their tunnels and fight the invaders to their dying breath. As many as 18,375 Japanese troops were either killed or marked as MIA in the battle. With this in mind, just 216 were taken prisoner, and these were the ones who were too wounded to fight back or to kill themselves. The Americans sustained a total of 26,000 casualties, which was around 23.6% of their starting strength. The Marines did take Iwo Jima, but this was after 5 weeks of the bloodiest fighting in that theater of the war. In a pair of recent videos, we provided an overview of World War II's New Guinea campaign, from the Japanese invasion to the savage struggle for control of the mainland to the Allied counteroffensive and victory. As we stated in those videos, the entire campaign tends to go a little under the radar, but this is especially true for one battle, one of the most crucial victories of the Pacific War, and a miniature Japanese D-Day. In this video, we're going to delve deeper into the Battle of Milne Bay. By mid-1942, Imperial Japan's general plan with New Guinea and Papua was to seize Port Moresby on the island's southern coast. To do this, they would advance over the Owen Stanley Mountains via the Kokoda Track and make an amphibious invasion on Papua's eastern tip via Milne Bay. Fighting their way south and west, respectively, they would then shut their pincer on Port Moresby and deliver the Australian and Americans a crippling blow. But this was not to be. The Allies terminated the Japanese advance over the mountains, and the Battle of Milne Bay proved disastrous for the invaders, who came up against a stalwart Australian defence. Like a lot of the island, the Milne Bay area didn't make for the cleanest of battlefields. While there were flat coastal areas, the land was also strewn with rivers and swamps, and floods could turn the entire place into a muddy hellscape. Of course, the mosquitoes loved this, and many of those horrible little turds were carrying malaria. Not all of Milne Bay was mud though. Some areas were flat and accessible by dirt roads and jetties. To protect Port Moresby, American General Douglas MacArthur ordered the construction of 3 airstrips in Milne Bay in these flatter areas. They started building No. 1 airstrip, which is now PNG's Gurney Airport, on the 8th of June 1942, and by late July they were working on the No. 2 airstrip. This second one, however, couldn't be completed without the construction of a couple of bridges, so they put it on the back burner and got started on No. 3 airstrip. While the Battle of Milne Bay hadn't started properly yet, the Japanese caught wind of these construction projects and started strafing and bombing them. The Royal Australian Air Force staved them off, and knowing the Japanese were planning an invasion, Australian and American military personnel massed in the area. By the 22nd of August, there were almost 7,500 Australian Army and RAAF personnel and 1,365 Americans in Milne Bay. While No. 30 Squadron and No. 100 Squadron RAAF flew in later, 75 and 76 Squadrons RAAF were largely responsible for the skies and proved vital to the Allied defence. We know there were over 8,800 Allied personnel in Milne Bay by August 1942, but the Japanese didn't. They thought there were maybe 300 to 600 Aussies operating in Milne Bay, and they planned accordingly. To throw another spanner in the works, the Japanese Navy and Japanese Army were at each other's throats again. The Army refused to work with the Navy to make the landing, so the Navy took matters into its own hands. Transported to Milne Bay by the 8th Fleet, some 1,940 Japanese naval infantry from several Kaigon Oko Sentai, or Special Naval Landing Forces, would bring the fight to the Allies over the land. They also brought along a pair of Type 95 Hargo tanks, which, in a different environment, might not have been a laughing matter. So, how did it all go down? On the 23rd and 24th of August, the Japanese opened with aerial bombardments, paving the way for their fleets. On the 24th, one Japanese convoy composed of 7 landing barges carrying 350 Japanese naval infantrymen pulled up on Goodenough Island to the north of Milne Bay for a rest. This was a big mistake. At around lunchtime, 12 Kitty Hawks of 75 and 76 squadrons flew to Goodenough and strafed the barges until all 7 of them were ripped to shreds. For now, those 350 naval infantrymen were stranded. At the night of the 25th, the main Japanese invasion took place, with some 1,250 men landing on the north shore of the bay near a place called Wagga Wagga, a good distance east of where they had intended to land. Virtually unopposed, they established a beachhead. With sunrise, the Japanese set out through the jungle behind their Type 95s, going head to head with the Aussies. While the Japanese were busy with their advance, the RAAF hit their beachhead, obliterating a significant portion of their supplies and more of their landing barges. But the Japanese couldn't do jack about it. Poor weather and Allied air superiority kept their fighters on the ground. Back in the jungle, the Aussies were having a tough time with the tanks. They couldn't get their anti-tank guns into position alongside the muddy coastal track, and a Japanese cruiser was also bombarding them from the bay. With air and artillery support though, the Aussies were able to push the invaders back a bit and then withdraw west to the Gama River to catch their collective breath. As the sun rose on the 27th, 8 Japanese dive bombers and 12 Zeros attacked No. 1 airstrip but caused minimal damage. They lost 1 plane to defensive fire. Meanwhile, the Aussies bolstered their position along the Gama River, where intense fighting took place that day and that night. Riding their tanks, the Japanese were able to inflict significant casualties on the Aussies and drive them back to the unfinished No. 3 airstrip near a place called Kilabo. The airstrip turned out to be a solid defensive position with plenty of open space for gunning people down. The Aussies brought reinforcements to the airstrip and laid mines in anticipation of the troublesome Type 95s. Only the tanks didn't come. Both vehicles had fallen prey to the mud on the way in, and the Japanese abandoned them. Having lost one of their only advantages, the Japanese were knocked back at No. 3 airstrip. Guided by flares and smoke shells fired by the Australian infantrymen, the RAAF Kitty Hawks soared in and had a field day, strafing the withdrawing Japanese again and again. Over the next few days, the Japanese landed more troops and supplies at Wagga Wagga and prepared for a major assault on No. 3 airstrip. At 3 AM on the 31st of August, they rushed it with a series of suicidal banzai attacks. The Aussies were prepared though. The Japanese ran headfirst into a killing field peppered with lit flares. Machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire tore them limb from limb, and the surviving naval infantrymen picked up their guts and fled back into the jungle. This was a pivotal moment in the Battle of Milne Bay. As the sun rose, and with the Japanese on their back foot, the Aussies launched a counterattack. Over the next 2 days, it became obvious to the Japanese that they were fighting a losing battle. Naturally, they now intended to give the Aussies as hard of a time as possible by playing as dirty as possible. On the 2nd of September, Japanese commander Minoru Yano radioed the following message to his superiors. "We have reached the worst possible situation. We will together calmly defend our position to the death." One of their go-to tactics was to play dead or wounded until the Aussies were right up next to them, then come to life and attack. According to Australian Sergeant Arthur Trail, as our officer crossed into the vanguard, a Jap, apparently wounded, cried out for help. The officer walked over to aid him, and as he did, the Jap sprang to life and hurled a grenade which wounded him in the face. From then on, the only good Jap was a dead one. The Aussies shot or bayoneted any dead bodies they came across just to be sure and stopped taking prisoners. As for the Japanese, they had already been mutilating and executing the Australian troops they'd captured, not to mention all the locals they raped and killed. Throughout this time, the Flyboys continued to tear through the withdrawing Japanese, paving the way for the advancing Australian infantrymen. By the 5th, the Japanese High Command, despite Yano's eagerness to stay behind and die, ordered a withdrawal from Milne Bay. Over the next 2 days, they evacuated their remaining troops from the bay, leaving behind more than 600 corpses. Some Japanese naval infantrymen tried to flee overland, but the Aussies mopped them up. The Japanese weren't able to rescue their troops stranded on Goodenough Island until the 24th of October. In contrast, 167 Aussies were killed or declared missing in action, while 206 were wounded. Winning the Battle of Milne Bay, the Allies continued turning the Milne Bay area into an airbase and built a wharf there too. They also got absolutely drilled by a malaria epidemic, which probably caused more damage than the Japanese. With Milne Bay out of their reach, the Japanese strategy for Port Moresby crumbled. The Allied victory at Milne Bay did wonders for morale, often referred to as the first major defeat of Japanese forces on land. In the words of British Field Marshal Bill Slim, Australian troops had, at Milne Bay in New Guinea, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. Of all the Allies was the Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. Australia punched well above its weight during the Second World War. From the battlefields of North Africa to the seas of the Pacific, Australians gained a reputation for fighting to the bitter end. In this video, we illustrate yet another epic last stand from the Royal Australian Navy, where one sloop went up against an entire Japanese flotilla. This is the story of Robert Rankin, Buck Taylor, and HMAS Yarra. The Grimsby-class sloop HMAS Yarra was launched in 1935 from Cockatoo Island off of Sydney. She had a new design and was built to replace the aging ships built during the Great War. Her armament consisted of 3 4-inch guns which were primarily designed for high-altitude anti-aircraft defense. As secondary armament, Yarra was fitted with 50 cal and 303 machine guns for close anti-aircraft defense. Her full war complement was 160 officers and crew. When war broke out in September 1939, Yarra was sent to bulk up British forces in the Red Sea. As a smaller vessel, the sloop was assigned to escort duties, looking after merchant ships as they transited from British India to Mesopotamia with supplies and reinforcements for the war effort in North Africa. Yarra was attacked by high-flying Italian bombers on several occasions, but the Regia Aeronautica never scored a hit. Yarra maintained her vigil in the Red Sea until April 1941, when German agents successfully staged a coup in Iraq. The pro-British ruler was replaced by Prime Minister Rashid Ali, who planned to boot the British from Iraq once and for all. Yarra's small size meant that she could steam up the Shatt al-Arab River to lend fire support to the Allied landings in Bassa. For the next month, Yarra acted as a mobile artillery platform, bombarding Iraqi positions with her 4-inch guns and laying down suppressive fire with her 50s. By May 24th, the landing forces had captured their objectives and Rashid Ali's government was collapsing. The Australian sloop had fought her first battle, but the worst had yet to come. When Axis forces invaded the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa, Army Group South quickly swept through Ukraine toward the Caucasus. This posed a major threat to British holdings in Iran. Less than 1,000 kilometers separates Tehran from Tbilisi, and the Iranian oil fields were a prize the British could not afford to lose. German agents were active in the country and tolerated by the governing regime. Fearing a situation similar to Iraq, the British and Soviets jointly invaded. The invasion's naval contingent was pulled together from whichever vessels were available nearby. One of them was Yarra, which incidentally was one of the most heavily armed. At 0400 on August 25th, Yarra stemmed from her anchorage at Bassa to the Iranian naval base on the bank of Shatt al-Arab. Here, she attacked and sunk the sloop Babur with 10 salvos from her heavy guns. When 2 gunboats fought back, Yarra hit them with a hail of machine gun fire before drawing alongside and boarding them. Cooks and stewards armed with rifles went over the side and captured one gunboat after another. 90 Iranian and Italian prisoners were thrown in Yarra's brig. Over the next few days, Yarra captured several shore facilities and an Italian freighter. Their naval forces extinguished and facing setbacks on land, the Iranian government accepted British and Soviet terms on September the 2nd. But Yarra wasn't done. She was immediately sent to the Mediterranean to help resupply the beleaguered troops at Tobruk. Scores of ships ran the gauntlet between the British naval base at Alexandria and besieged Tobruk. They carried ammunition and medical supplies and returned with wounded soldiers. These supply runs, nicknamed by the Aussies the Tobruk Ferry Service, were vital for maintaining the Allied foothold in North Africa. But the Axis knew this too. U-boats stalked the waves and the Luftwaffe prowled the skies in search of these resupply ships. In late 1941, Yarra was constantly at sea as part of the Tobruk Ferry Service. She was attacked by a squadron of 35 Stuka dive bombers on December 7th, but avoided getting hit. Her fellow British sloop HMS Flamingo wasn't so lucky, and Yarra towed the incapacitated Flamingo back to port. This was the last Yarra saw of the Mediterranean. Imperial Japan had announced its entry into the global conflict with the Pearl Harbor attack, and the Australian people felt they were all under threat. All ships were needed in the Pacific. Yarra arrived in Batavia in mid-January 1942. She was immediately put to work escorting supply convoys between Java and Singapore. By January's end, the Japanese army was closing in and the British blew up the causeway, separating Singapore from the Malay Peninsula. On February 3rd, a 9-ship convoy entered Sunda Strait bound for Singapore, packed with troops and equipment. Yarra was one of its escorts, along with 3 cruisers, a destroyer, and 2 other sloops. Such a strong presence was supposed to deter the tenacious Japanese. As the convoy neared its destination, Japanese planes appeared in the sky. They dove toward the fleet, dropping bombs and strafing the decks of the freighters. As Yarra was one of the smallest ships present, she was ignored, but this decision had deadly consequences for the attackers. Yarra spat anti-aircraft fire from all of her guns, striking one plane and sending it tumbling into the sea. More were blown to pieces by interlocking anti-aircraft fire from other ships, but the damage was done. The 17,000-ton transport Empress of Asia was on fire. Soldiers crowded the bow and stern of the vessel to escape the inferno within. Yarra launched her boats and rescued no less than 1,804 men from the stricken transport. She was so overloaded that the new passengers were ordered to sit down so their swaying didn't impact the ship's handling. The soldiers from Empress of Asia were rescued, but all their equipment was lost. Singapore was lost to the Japanese in late February, and control of the waves went with it after the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea on the 28th. The Allies withdrew. Yarra left Cilacap on Java's southern coast on March the 2nd, escorting the depot ship Unking, the tanker Frankhol, and the minesweeper MMS 51. Her captain, Robert Rankin, had orders to see the small fleet safely to Fremantle in Western Australia. As Yarra steamed toward her objective, she sighted a seaplane in the distance, but it was too far away to shoot at. It disappeared soon after, and Yarra's crew hoped that that would be the last they saw of their enemy. They were wrong. The seaplane belonged to a detached heavy cruiser squadron of Admiral Kondo's IJN 2nd Fleet. The heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, and Maya, and the destroyers Arashi and Owaki were stalking the ocean south of Java in search of escaping Allied ships. On the same day Yarra departed, they sank the destroyer USS Pillsbury. There were no survivors. At 6:30 AM on March 4th, Yarra's sirens rung out, urging sailors to their battle stations. The Japanese fleet had been spotted and was steaming directly for the convoy. Rankin ordered the ships to scatter and swung Yarra's bow toward the enemy. Each of the Japanese heavy cruisers had 10 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch guns. With nothing but her 3 little 4 inches, Yarra couldn't have been much more outgunned. So what did Rankin do? He charged. Yarra laid a heavy screen of smoke around the convoy, obscuring them from Japanese view. Rankin then put his ship between the convoy and the enemy and beelined for the Japanese. He knew one sloop had no chance against 3 heavy cruisers, but that didn't matter. His job was to protect the convoy, and that's what he was going to do. Japanese shells peppered the convoy, and soon fires were raging on Yarra's deck. Behind her, Anking's hull was breached and she went down. Next was the lumbering tanker Frankhol. The clouds of black smoke billowed out as her oil caught fire, setting the ocean ablaze. The minesweeper was then sunk by a hail of close-range destroyer fire. Yarra was last. She was set on fire almost immediately, but continued firing against the Japanese fleet for 90 minutes. She flung shell after shell into the Japanese heavy cruisers, forcing them to open up the distance. Then, at 0800, burning from bow to stern and listing heavily to one side, Rankin gave the order to abandon ship. Seconds later, the bridge was hit, killing him and the whole bridge crew. In a forward gun turret, leading seaman Buck Taylor manned his gun until he went under, despite Rankin's order. He loaded and fired shells alone until Yarra disappeared beneath the waves. After annihilating the convoy, the Japanese did not stop to pick up Yarra's survivors. 5 days later, 13 sailors were picked up by the Dutch submarine K-11. They were all that remained of Yarra's 151-man crew. In 2014, Yarra's crew received a posthumous unit citation for gallantry, and in 2001, a Collins-class submarine was named HMAS Rankin in honor of the captain. Its motto, fittingly, is "Defend the Weak." The brave little sloop went up against an entire Japanese fleet on its own, throwing everything it had at the enemy to buy time for the unarmed ships to escape. In 1935, US Army General Billy Mitchell said that Alaska was the most important strategic place in the world. And yet, the battles which took place there during the Second World War tend to go under the radar. Between June 1942 and August 1943, US forces fought the Japanese in the Aleutian Islands, with the Japanese occupying Kiska and Attu. In this video, we're gonna shed some light on the Battle of Attu, in which Allied forces faced one of the biggest Japanese banzai attacks of the entire war. By May 1942, US naval intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes and learnt that a Japanese naval fleet led by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogeya was headed for Alaska. Within Hosogeya's fleet were 2 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 submarines, 4 troop transports, and a number of supporting vessels. In response, US forces in the area swelled. By June, 45,000 military personnel were stationed in Alaska, covered by the USAAF's 11th Air Force in the air and Task Force 8 in the sea. Hoping to eliminate Hosogaya before he reached the shore, the 11th sent out reconnaissance planes. Once they spotted Hosogaya, they would direct Task Force 8 so it could meet the Japanese Vice Admiral in the sea. But due to poor weather, this naval confrontation never came to pass, and on the 3rd of June, it was Hosogaya who landed the first punch. And it was a flaccid first punch indeed, as only half of Hosogaya's bombers reached their objective, the naval base at Dutch Harbour on Amaknak Island. The rest became lost in the fog, obscuring their approach, and either returned to their carriers or crashed. Those bombers that did make it through the fog faced heavy anti-aircraft fire and ultimately did little damage to the harbour. A second attack the next day saw more success, with Hosogaya's bombers hitting the base's barracks, oil storage tanks and hospital. The Vice Admiral had intended to follow these raids with an invasion of the island of Adak, but once again, the weather stood against him, forcing him to look elsewhere in the Aleutian Islands for a place to deposit his troops. On the 6th, 500 personnel of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces landed on the island of Kiska. Just 10 US Navy personnel were there to defend it. Storming the weather station, the Japanese killed 2 of these men and captured 7. 1 man got away. The following day, the Japanese landed on Atsu, and 1,140 men under Major Matsutoshi Hosumi took the island virtually unopposed, capturing 46 civilians and killing 1. Now that Hosogaya had secured 2 footholds in Alaska, fear spread throughout the US. According to Lieutenant Bob Brocklehurst of the US 18th Fighter Squadron, "We figured that the Japanese, if they wanted to, could have come up the Aleutians, taken Anchorage, and come down past Vancouver to Seattle, Washington." In response, the US set up an airbase on Adak and started bombing the Japanese on Kiska, softening Hosogaya's defenses in preparation for an eventual American invasion. Hosogaya answered by relocating his forces from Atsu to Kiska in August, leaving Atsu unoccupied until October, when some 2,900 men under one Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki rocked up to once again secure the island. Yamasaki immediately got to work fortifying Atsu and building an airfield in anticipation of an American invasion. Codenamed Operation Land Crab, said invasion began on the 11th of May 1943. Brought to bear against Yamasaki were some 15,000 men of US Major General Albert Brown's 7th Infantry Division, to which the 1st Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon, nicknamed Kastner's Cutthroats, was attached. Despite a numerical advantage, the Battle of Atsu was no walk in the park for the Americans. They weren't just facing the Japanese, but the island itself. In the introduction of The Capture of Attu, author Gregory J.W. Irwin described the island as such: a jumble of sheer snow-capped peaks, barren volleys of brown tundra, and narrow beaches. Attu hardly seems the kind of place for which sensible men would give their lives. Irwin also went on to quote the New York Times military editor and analyst Henson W. Baldwin, who had the following to say about Attu: "Sudden fierce squalls rage around the island. Fog is always prevalent, and the clinging white mist is so thick that soldiers advancing across the rocky hills lose sight of each other. The supporting fire of naval vessels cannot be observed. Planes cannot bomb." To truly understand the conditions the men faced, however, we have to join them in their foxholes, just as United Press correspondent Russell Annabelle did. In Annabelle's words, "Under the cover of fog and darkness, you would dig a foxhole and put up a breastwork of cut sodden rocks. You were already wet from fording streams and falling into sinkholes, and now you were standing in a foot or more of bitterly cold water. You couldn't search for a drier place, because by this time, Jap snipers and mortar crews had spotted you." Of course, the Japanese had had more time to adapt to the hell that was Atsu than the Americans, digging a network of underground tunnels and chambers in which they could keep themselves dry, and setting up camouflage machine gun and sniper positions in the mountains, turning the mountain passes they knew the Americans would need to use into kill zones. The Japanese were better dressed for the occasion too, donning fur-lined clothes and woven mittens. From the 11th to the 16th of May, Major General Brown's morale plummeted. He simply could not break Yamasaki's defense in the aptly named Massacre Valley, just inland from the US Southern Landing Force's landing place at Massacre Bay. On the 14th, Brown reported the following: "The Japanese positions are difficult to locate and almost impossible to shoot out with artillery. They produce casualties in excess of casualties which can be returned. Progress through mountain passes will require troops in excess to those now available to my command." On the 16th, Brown was cut loose. General Eugene M. Landrum replaced him, and he must have been a far more competent commander because he quickly broke the stalemate. From that point forward, despite the frostbite blackening the American soldiers' toes, Yamasaki was out of his depth. The US North Landing Force marched inland and, joining the Southern Landing Force, drove the Japanese northeast toward Chichagof Harbor. Now, Yamasaki's situation was looking desperate. Naval reinforcements promised to him were no longer coming. Mainland Japan had abandoned the poor man, and victory was all but impossible. All that he could do now was keep his honor by fighting to the death or ending his own life. On the 29th of May, Yamasaki gathered as many as 1,000 survivors and launched a massive banzai attack against the Americans. In the lead up to the attack, Nebsi Tatsukuchi, who served in the Japanese North Sea Defense Field Hospital, penned the following in his diary: "Today, we assembled in front of HQs. The field hospital took part 2. The last assault is to be carried out. All the patients in the hospital were to commit suicide. Only 33 years of living, and I am to die here. I have no regrets. Banzai to the Emperor." During the attack, the Japanese overran 2 US command posts and a US medical station, engaging the Americans in ferocious close-quarters combat. But they were always destined to fail, and most of those who didn't fall to American bullets fell on their own blades or committed suicide by other means. The US correspondent, Robert Sherrod, described the carnage like this: "The results of the fanaticism stagger the imagination. It is incomprehensible to the Western mind. I saw one sitting impaled on a bayonet which was stuck through his back, evidently by a friend. Most of them had simply held grenades against their stomachs or chests. Probably 1 in 4 held a grenade against his head. There were many headless bodies between Massacre Bay and Chichagof. From the 11th to the 30th of May, 2,872 Japanese either committed suicide or were killed by American forces, including Yamasaki. The remaining 28, remember their starting strength was 2,900, were taken as POWs. On the American side, 549 men were killed, while 1,148 were wounded and 1,814 became sick, with some of the latter dying as a result. Author Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that both the Japanese and Americans would have done well to have left the Aleutians to the Aleuts for the course of the war. Alaska was once called the most important strategic place in the world. Whoever held it held the world, according to General Billy Mitchell, the father of the US Air Force. During World War II, Alaska became a battleground for the US and Japan. Japan's invasion of the Alaskan territory was the only invasion of the United States during the Second World War. Japan managed to take hold of 2 islands in the outer Aleutians, but they were still at a significant disadvantage. The weather and terrain in Alaska were unforgiving for those unfamiliar with it, so the United States put together a band of Arctic Scouts, a unit familiar with the landscape that could survive the harsh conditions with minimal training and equipment. Their job was to run reconnaissance missions and gather intel on the Japanese invaders. In this video, we'll discuss why these Alaska Scouts absolutely terrified the Japanese. Japan took the island of Kiska on June 6, 1942 and Attu on June 7th. This made the United States nervous. The Japanese held a position that made US counterattacks nigh impossible. The climate was harsh and prone to intense winds, snow, and sleet squalls, making things even more difficult for the Americans. US soldiers were largely ill-equipped for such conditions, and many didn't know the first thing about survival, even in ideal conditions. While the conditions were extreme, it was not impossible to survive and even thrive in the Aleutian Islands. The indigenous Aleut people had already been doing it for 9,000 years. Intelligence Chief of the US Army's Alaska Defense Command, Colonel Lawrence Kastner, understood the advantage these sorts of survival skills could offer the army. His father, Major General Joseph Kastner, had been one of the first commanders of the Philippine Scouts, a special military group created during the Spanish-American War made up of natives who gathered intel for the United States. Colonel Kastner knew that a similar group of Alaska natives would make better scouts than anyone else. He brought up the idea to his superiors and was given the green light to form the 1st Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon in early 1942, more commonly known as the Alaska Scouts. He began recruiting and searching for those he thought would be a good fit. The Alaska Scouts' task was to gather intelligence via mapping and surveying, but they also needed to master commando-style fighting. It wasn't easy to become an Alaska Scout. The standards were very high and many were rejected. In the end, Colonel Kastner handpicked 66 men for the job. The group comprised indigenous Aleuts and Eskimos, fishermen, hunters, trappers, dog sledders, prospectors, and miners. Colonel Kastner said they have one thing in common: they're tough. Being tough wasn't the only trait the Alaska Scouts shared, however. They also weren't fans of military rules, ranks, and rigidness. Because of that, and because their job was so critical to the United States, the Alaska Scouts were granted special privileges. They never used ranks, were allowed to carry whatever weapon they wanted, and didn't wear army uniforms or any kind of identifiers. They mostly wore buckskins and cowboy-style hats, but one scout, named Larry Beloff, was the owner of 2 Alaskan gold mines and always wore a diamond ring and diamond-studded watch, earning him the nickname Diamond Jim. Their reputation eventually earned them the nickname Kastner's Cutthroats, which stuck among other army personnel, but not among the cutthroats themselves. They preferred to be called the Alaska Scouts, so that's what we'll stick with. Their primary mission was as simple as it was crucial: observe the enemy without detection and send intel to the commander, who would call the shots from there. But that wasn't all they did. After the Japanese took Kiska and Attu, the US desperately needed an airstrip closer to the islands from which they could launch bombing raids, since they had already lost several planes to the Alaskan weather and needed airfields closer to the Japanese. The problem was that the islands best suited for airstrips were unmapped. This was where the Scouts came in, splitting into 2 groups to survey different islands. The first secret landing was on Adak Island, where there were no Japanese. Here they found the land was far too mountainous and rugged for a landing strip. Instead, they built a dam to make a lagoon, then drained it and used the sandy bottom as a temporary landing strip. Smart thinking on their part. Another group went to Amchitka Island, where they quickly found a suitable spot for a landing strip and built one. This allowed the US to start bombing Kiska and form a naval blockade to prevent Japanese supplies from reaching the island. But the Scouts played their most crucial role when the US decided to launch its campaign to retake Attu. The retaking of Attu, also known as Operation Sandcrab, involved 15,000 US troops breaking up into 3 groups to attack the Japanese garrison from multiple directions, encircling them. In the early morning on May 11, 1943, a group of Alaska Scouts rowed 1,000 yards through freezing, rough water in a plastic whaleboat to Beach Red, a narrow strip of the coast on Attu Island, to see if it would be possible for the US troops attacking them from the north to land there. This would have been a suicide mission for anyone else, but the Scouts navigated through the fog and black water skillfully and silently, landing on the beach without being detected by the Japanese. They gave the Northern Infantry the all-clear signal, and US boats began to disgorge their troops. Wasting no time, the Scouts began the next phase of their mission, scouring the rest of the island for the Japanese. By mid-afternoon, they'd spotted a group of Japanese soldiers from the top of a ridge. While the Scouts had an advantageous position, the thick fog made it difficult to ascertain the enemy soldiers' positions, and the US infantry was struggling to keep up with the Scouts. The troops sent to Alaska had trained in the Mojave Desert, as they were originally signed for duty in North Africa. They didn't have any warm weather gear as it was in short supply, and their boots weren't even waterproof. The US Army had decided that this wouldn't matter because the battle would only last 3 days or so, but they had miscalculated. Some bad calls from command had slowed the soldiers in all three groups and gave the Japanese time to pin down some US units, making advancement all but impossible. The soldiers were freezing and their feet were constantly wet, resulting in frostbite and trench foot. Without the Alaska Scouts, they would almost have certainly been unable to carry out their mission. The Scouts kept them alive, using their survival skills to stave off cold and starvation. But they weren't only there to keep the soldiers' hearts beating. After 2 days on Attu, George Gray, an Alaska Scout who held a good position on a ridge above them, was ordered to create a diversion and draw Japanese fire so the infantry could advance and take much needed control of the Holtz Valley. Just after he'd been given the orders, he saw the infantry start to advance, throwing off his plan entirely. So Gray just went for it, grabbing a rifle, 3 grenades and a few other scouts, and charged. The Japanese spotted them and began firing machine guns and throwing grenades, but much to the shock of the Japanese, they all survived. For the Japanese, spotting a scout meant spotting danger. There was nowhere they could go on the island where the scouts couldn't find them. Despite their best efforts, the Japanese found that they were very difficult to kill, and this scared them even more. When the infantry eventually took control of Holtz Valley, they unknowingly destroyed the Japanese defense in the process. The scouts patrolled the island for 2 weeks, noting the surviving Japanese soldiers' positions and passing this information on to the troops. Using scout intel, the 3 US infantry groups created a semicircle around their enemy, cutting them off from their supplies. This is what ultimately led to one of the most bloody Japanese banzai attacks in World War II. Beaten, but refusing to surrender, the remaining Japanese soldiers attacked the sleeping US infantry, screaming, "We die, you die too." The scouts weren't there, however. They were holding a position on a mountain far away from the infantry and could only watch through their binoculars as the Japanese killed US soldiers and themselves. And with that, the American operation on Attu Islands came to an end. The scouts were sent to the island of Kiska next. Their mission was the same as it had been for Attu, but when they arrived, they found the island abandoned. The Japanese had heard about what was happening on Attu and knew they were next, so they got out while they still could. Better to give up a good position than let an Alaska Scout spot you. The Alaska Scouts undertook only minor jobs after their success in the Aleutians. Colonel Kastner received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1944 for his role in organizing and leading the Scouts. Without them, it's unlikely the US would have been able to take the islands back from the Japanese. There can be no doubt about it. The horror of the Second Sino-Japanese War still exists in the shadow of World War II, and what a ridiculous truth that is. How could such a terrible scar be forgotten? How can all those lives, not figures, lives, be swept under the rug? Of course, we needn't always think of such things, but when we want to, when we punch World War II into Google or fire up a documentary, why isn't Chinese suffering the first thing we see? Well, there are many reasons for this, most being political, though in this video, we're not looking at the why so much as the what, and we're not going to focus on big, terrifying death and casualty numbers. Instead, we're going to try and paint the suffering of China in the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II in a different light, focusing on how China's bravery attributed to its own survival and an Allied victory. Before we get into China's bravery and contributions to the Allied cause, it's important we know at least the basics of the Second Sino-Japanese War, as during this conflict was when China suffered most, and during this suffering was when China exhibited much of its bravery. Basically, Sino-Japanese relations had been bad for quite a while, though things escalated with the Mukden or Manchurian incident, in which the Japanese blew up one of their own railways in China and blamed the Chinese, and the subsequent Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which began on the 18th of September 1931. Here, the Imperial Japanese invaded the Chinese regions known collectively as Manchuria and set up a puppet state, which they called Manchukuo. What followed was some 6 years of skirmishing until the Japanese pressed forward and enjoyed a series of major victories, capturing Beijing, Shanghai, and what was then the Chinese capital, Nanking. Other Chinese cities were lost to the Japanese invaders though, marked by a costly victory in the 1939 Battle of Changsha, where the Chinese defenders managed to slow their enemy's advance, turning the tide of the conflict thereon, but not without spending many more Chinese lives. The Second Sino-Japanese War continued as basically a distinct theatre of World War II, in which the Chinese kept their occupiers thoroughly occupied. Yet, keeping the Japanese busy was in itself a crucial contribution to the Allied victory, and some of the battles which occurred in this time, including the aforementioned and pivotal 1939 Battle of Changsha, speak for the bravery of this nation, which is so often consigned to an afterthought when pondering the Second World War. Let's begin by encompassing the Second Sino-Japanese War as a World War II theatre on a whole, and then narrow our scope to encompass that pivotal battle, the First Battle of Changsha, before discussing China's alliance with the Allies and its involvement in Burma. While the United States had become China's main military supporter by 1940, the Chinese military was generally unprepared for war of this caliber, lacking the industry to equip a modern force. As a result, they made use of the Fabian strategy, avoiding head-on conflicts and aiming to starve their enemy in a war of attrition. Specifically, they used scorched earth strategies, flooding their own land to bog down their enemy, and they also lured their enemy into compromising positions, from which they could ambush, flank, and encircle them. Paramilitary resistance forces were employed, and these were tasked with making Japanese occupation as difficult as possible. The Chinese also made good use of their home ground advantage, sneaking through the countryside between Japanese-held cities and sabotaging railways and crucial Japanese-held infrastructure, such as coal mines. So why is all of this significant? Well, the Chinese were playing for time and, more importantly, wasting Japanese time. The Japanese troops in China were stuck there, growing hungry and fighting the exact opposite of the quick war they were planning to win. As such, they were not fighting the Allies in any of the other theatres, most notably the Pacific. Of course, the number of Japanese soldiers in China changed from day to day, though some 600,000 were there in 1937 and around twice that many were there in 1945. Now, let's zoom in on the First Battle of Changsha in 1939. As we said earlier, this was a pivotal battle for the Chinese, marking the end of the unchecked Japanese advance. Here, a 100,000 strong Japanese force, comprised of the 11th Army and commanded by Imperial Japanese General Yasuji Okamura, converged on the provincial capital Changsha from two sides. The Chinese defenders had the numbers, boasting a strength of some 240,000 troops of the 9th War Area's 1st, 19th, 20th, 27th and 30th Army groups, which were commanded by Chen Cheng. The result was battle in which the Chinese made excellent use of the aforementioned Fabian strategy, avoiding head-on fighting and instead luring their enemy into compromising positions before flanking and encircling them. They were also sure to destroy as many of their enemy's supply lines as possible. The October 16, 1939 issue of Time magazine summed it up quite well. The Chinese turned around and, with the fury they've never shown before, lashed the Japanese back and back. The Chinese destroyed every rail line, every road. The Japanese blithely advanced over this torn-up area until they were in the worst military position known to man, on a thin front without communications behind. That was when the Chinese struck. The Japanese had nothing to do but run. As we said before, the United States was China's main military benefactor after 1940, though it wasn't until after the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 that China joined the Allies and declared war on the tripartite Axis powers. A bit over a month later, the Chinese defeated the Japanese in the Third Battle of Changsha, gaining the respect of the Allied powers, and China soon after earned its place as one of them, as one of the Big Four. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however, and we must acknowledge that political and strategic differences were a cause for tension.
For instance, it is postulated that the Allies wanted China to be more aggressive, while China wanted to continue fighting a defensive war of attrition, while the US built up its industry and overwhelmed the Japanese for them. This, of course, would have caused the Allies to lose some of their confidence in China. It's also important to note that prior to the support of Western allies, the Soviet Union provided China most of its foreign aid. The Soviets even defeated Japan and Manchukuo in the battles of Khalkhin-Gol, instilling fear in the Japanese and dissuading their advance into China, for a time. And also, before World War II, Germany actually supported the Chinese Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, providing some 80,000 Chinese soldiers, who later fought for China as a whole, with military training. Hitler, however, withdrew this support in favour of an alliance with China's principal enemy, Japan. Now onto Chinese involvement in Burma. For some context, Burma was a part of the British Empire at the start of World War II, and after the United States became China's military benefactor, it supplied China through Burma via the Burma Road. The Japanese, naturally, didn't want to let China get those supplies, and they also wanted to seize Burma's raw materials, its oil, its cobalt, and even its rice, so they invaded Burma from the south, though not without resistance. See, protecting Burma Road was an obvious reason for China to put down its foot, though China was now also one of the Big Four, and its ally Britain, as well as British Burma and British India, needed a hand. While the Allies were ultimately forced to withdraw, surrendering Burma and the Burma Road to the Japanese, the Chinese Expeditionary Force was there, and despite being poorly equipped, it fought bravely. One particular conflict in which said bravery shone was the Battle of Yengangwang on the 19th of April 1942. Here, the Burma Corps, a British, Indian and Burmese force, was defending the Irrawaddy River when the Japanese attacked, intending to take the Yengangwang oil fields, which were in the valley. Ultimately, 7,000 soldiers of the Burma Corps, as well as some 500 prisoners and civilians, were encircled by around 7,000 Japanese soldiers on the oil field, and things were looking grim. But then, rallied under Chinese General Sun Li-jen, a force of 1,121 Chinese, of which some 400 weren't even soldiers, came to their rescue, breaking the encirclement, inflicting heavy casualties on the Japanese, and forcing them to withdraw. Even though the Allies did withdraw from Burma in 1942, they were able to take it back from their enemy between early 1943 and early 1945, though not without the Chinese Expeditionary Force, which fought side by side with the famed US Special Forces unit named Merrill's Marauders. By the end of the war, China was one of the Big Four allies and it held a seat on the United Nations Security Council, though for a whole bunch of complicated political reasons which we've gracefully avoided in this video, China's contributions to the Allied victory were swept under the rug, only becoming a topic for discussion in the wake of the Cold War. Millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians lost their lives in the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, and many of these men and women died fighting for China's survival and the Allied cause. They were more than just numbers, and their bravery and sacrifice must not be forgotten.